They kidnapped the wrong accountant. Now the deadliest man in the desert is coming for them. Close Quarters. Chapter 1. Nagalas smelled of diesel exhaust and burning trash during the day. At midnight, inside the rusted corrugated walls of the Matadero del Sol slaughterhouse, the air tasted entirely of raw iron and stale bleach. Brill Wingfield hung suspended from a heavy steel ventilation shaft, 20 feet above the primary processing floor. He did not move. He breathed in a slow, rhythmic cadence through his nose, letting the ambient temperature of the massive industrial freezer cool his core body heat. Frost rimmed the edges of the steel grate beneath him. Below, the abattoir was a cathedral of suspended carnage. Hundreds of skinned cattle carcasses hung from heavy iron meat hooks attached to an automated ceiling track. They formed a dense, fleshy forest, casting long, grotesque shadows under the flickering glare of overhead fluorescent tubes. The automated track was stationary for the night, leaving the massive sides of beef hanging in perfect, terrifying stillness. 4 men occupied the processing floor. They were not butchers. They wore heavy winter parkas over tactical load-bearing vests. Surliness and boredom radiated from their postures as they stood near a scarred stainless steel cutting table, smoking cheap cigarettes. The smoke plumed in the freezing air, mingling with the mist of their breath. They carried short-barreled Kalashnikov variants slung loosely across their chests. Cartel sicarios. Low-level enforcers guarding a high-value asset. Brill evaluated the tactical geometry. 4 targets. Open concrete floor. 0 cover between the ventilation shaft and the cutting table. A direct drop would trigger an immediate firefight. Gunfire would alert the outer perimeter guards patrolling the razor wire fence. He needed a silent avenue of approach. Shifting his weight with microscopic precision, Brill reached into a pouch on his tactical rig. He extracted a small, silenced glass punch. Pressing the tool against the corner of the heavy industrial grate separating him from the drop, he triggered the internal spring. The tempered glass covering the mesh shattered inward with a faint, muted crunch, barely audible over the relentless, bone-rattling hum of the massive Freon compressors lining the far wall. He slipped through the opening. Dropping silently into the freezing void, Brill aimed for the thickest cluster of hanging carcasses. He caught a heavy iron track rail with his gloved hands, absorbing the kinetic energy of the fall, his boots stopping mere inches above the frozen shoulder of a massive side of beef. Hanging in the shadows, he became part of the meat forest. He drew a combat knife. The blade was dark, non-reflective steel, curved like a hawk's beak. A karambit. Designed for infighting, for severing tendons and opening arteries before a man realized he was bleeding. Releasing his grip on the rail, Brill dropped the remaining distance to the floor. His soft-soled boots hit the blood-stained concrete without a sound. He crouched, completely hidden behind the frozen wall of meat. At the cutting table, the largest of the 4 sicarios flicked his cigarette butt onto the wet tile floor. "Check the accountant," the large man said in rapid, colloquial Spanish. "Make sure the rat hasn't frozen to death. The boss wants him breathing for the camera tomorrow." One of the younger guards grumbled, pulling his parka tight against the biting chill. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped away from the group, walking toward a heavy plastic curtain separating the processing floor from the drainage holding pens. Brill tracked the man's movement through a narrow gap between 2 carcasses. Timing his approach to match the heavy thud of the guard's boots, Brill moved laterally. He slipped between the hanging sides of beef, a shadow flowing through the cold. He intercepted the guard just as the man reached for the thick plastic strips of the curtain. Stepping out from behind a massive ribcage, Brill struck. He clamped his left hand over the guard's mouth, jerking the man's head violently backward to expose the throat. Simultaneously, he drove the curved blade of the karambit deep into the soft tissue beneath the jawline, severing the carotid artery and the windpipe in a single brutal upward hook. The guard convulsed, a massive surge of adrenaline fighting a losing battle against catastrophic blood loss. No scream escaped. The ruined throat produced only a wet, desperate hiss, entirely swallowed by the drone of the compressors. Brill rode the dying man to the floor, guiding the dead weight onto the concrete to prevent the heavy rifle from clattering. 3 targets remained. They were still gathered around the table, 30 feet away, arguing about a soccer match playing on a crackling transistor radio. Leaving the dead man in a growing pool of dark blood, Brill advanced. He did not crawl. He moved in a low crouch, utilizing the swinging carcasses for dynamic cover. He tapped a side of beef, sending it sliding gently along its greased track. The squeak of the iron wheel drew the attention of the large Sicario. The man turned, his brow furrowing as he stared into the dense rows of hanging meat. "Diego?" the large man called out, unslinging his Kalashnikov. "Stop playing around. It's too cold for this." Silence answered him. The large man tapped the shoulder of the guard next to him, gesturing toward the swaying carcass with the barrel of his rifle. The 2 men fanned out, raising their weapons, stepping cautiously into the frozen labyrinth. The 3rd man remained at the table, watching their backs. Dividing the force was a fatal tactical error. Brill waited for the first searcher to pass his position. As the man stepped beyond the edge of a frozen flank, Brill emerged from the blind spot directly behind him. He didn't use the knife. He grabbed the barrel of the man's rifle with his left hand, shoving it violently toward the ceiling. At the exact same instant, he drove the heel of his right palm directly upward into the base of the man's nose. Bone shattered, driving upward into the frontal lobe. The guard dropped like a stone, neurologically obliterated before his finger could tighten on the trigger. The large Sicario heard the scuffle. He spun around, raising his weapon, his eyes wide as he saw Brill standing over the fallen man. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. Brill threw the karambit. Spun with lethal calculated velocity, the curved blade crossed the 10 feet of open air in a dark blur. It buried itself to the hilt in the center of the large man's chest, piercing the sternum and plunging deep into the aortic valve. The Sicario gasped, dropping his rifle. He clawed at the handle protruding from his chest, his knees buckling, collapsing onto the frozen concrete. The final guard, at the cutting table, finally realized his unit was being slaughtered. Panic shattered his discipline. He raised his Kalashnikov and fired blindly into the hanging meat, a deafening roar of automatic fire that filled the abattoir with the smell of cordite and pulverized bone. Frozen chunks of meat exploded outward. 5.45 mm rounds ricocheted off the iron tracks overhead, showering the floor with sparks. Brill had already moved. Dropping beneath the line of fire, he sprinted forward, using the low concrete drainage trench for cover. He closed the distance while the panicked guard emptied his magazine into the shadows. The Kalashnikov clicked dry. As the guard desperately scrambled to reload, Brill vaulted out of the trench. He closed the last 5 feet in a single bound. He delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to the outside of the guard's knee, snapping the joint backward with a sickening crack. The guard screamed, pitching forward. Brill caught him by the collar of his parka, hauling him upright for a fraction of a second, before pivoting and driving the man headfirst into the solid steel edge of the cutting table. The scream ended abruptly. The guard slumped to the floor, leaving a thick smear of crimson across the sterile steel. The abattoir fell silent again, save for the hum of the compressors and the hiss of the ruptured hanging carcasses. 4 men dead in under 90 seconds. A perfectly executed, localized extermination. Retrieving his karambit from the chest of the large Sicario, Brill wiped the blade clean on the dead man's jacket. He sheathed the weapon. Reaching to his tactical rig, he drew a suppressed Mk-23 pistol, chambering a round. He walked toward the heavy plastic curtain leading to the holding pens. Pushing through the thick, bloody plastic strips, Brill entered a smaller, grimmer room. The temperature here was marginally warmer, smelling strongly of ammonia and raw sewage. A deep, sloped drainage grate ran down the center of the floor, designed to carry away the refuse of the slaughter. Chained to the center of the iron grate was Julian Reed. The forensic accountant was a portrait of absolute, unadulterated terror. He wore the shredded remains of a Brooks Brothers dress shirt and tailored slacks, now soaked in a horrific mixture of filthy water, blood, and his own urine. His face was a swollen, bruised mess. One eye was completely swollen shut. His hands were bound behind his back with industrial zip ties, tethered to the heavy iron grate by a rusted padlock and a length of logging chain. He was shivering so violently, his teeth chattered like a broken typewriter. Hearing footsteps approaching through the plastic curtain, Julian cowered. He pressed his bruised face against the wet concrete, squeezing his one good eye shut, waiting for the beatings to resume. "Please," Julian whimpered, his voice a broken, raspy croak. "I told you everything. I gave you the account numbers. Please." Brill stopped 3 feet away. He looked down at the pathetic, ruined civilian. Julian Reed was a man who lived his life in spreadsheets, boardrooms, and predictable financial algorithms. He had stumbled into a world of wolves, completely unequipped for the reality of physical violence. "The account numbers are compromised," Brill said. His voice was a flat, cold monotone that cut through the stink of the room. Julian flinched at the English words. He opened his good eye, blinking against the harsh overhead light. He saw the dark tactical boots. He slowly angled his head up, taking in the black combat sweater, the tactical rig, the suppressed pistol, and the utterly emotionless face of the man standing over him. Who are you?" Julian stammered, fresh tears cutting through the grime on his face. "Are you FBI? Did the Bureau send you?" "I am the extraction," Brill said. He holstered the MK-23. Kneeling beside the shivering accountant, Brill produced a set of specialized titanium lock picks from a concealed pocket on his wrist. "The men outside," Julian babbled, the adrenaline of sudden hope making him frantic. "The cartel guys. There are 4 of them. They have automatic weapons. They're going to come back." "They are not coming back," Brill said. He inserted a tension wrench into the rusted keyway of the padlock, following it with a rake pick. He worked purely by touch, his fingers feeling the minute friction of the tumblers. "We need backup," Julian insisted, twisting against the zip ties. "We need to call the Federales. Or the embassy. We can't just—" "Stop talking," Brill ordered. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone silenced the accountant instantly. A sharp, metallic click echoed in the damp room. The padlock sprang open. Brill unspooled the heavy logging chain from the iron grate. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears from his rig, slicing through the thick industrial zip ties binding Julian's wrists. The accountant collapsed forward, groaning as the blood rushed back into his numb hands. He massaged his raw wrists, staring at the shattered lock. Standing up, Brill grabbed a relatively clean, blood-stained industrial towel hanging from a nearby meat hook. He tossed it onto the floor next to Julian. "Wipe your face," Brill said. Julian grabbed the towel with shaking hands, pressing it against his bruised cheek. He looked up at Brill, his chest heaving. "What's the plan? Do you have a helicopter? An armored car?" Brill reached down, grabbing Julian by the collar of his ruined dress shirt, and hauled the man to his feet with terrifying ease. "The plan," Brill said, turning Julian toward the plastic curtain and the slaughterhouse floor beyond, "is not to die." He pushed the accountant forward into the cold. Chapter 2. The loading dock behind the slaughterhouse offered no sanctuary. Stepping out from the refrigerated nightmare of the processing floor, Julian Reed collided with the brittle, freezing air of the Mexican desert night. The Sonoran Badlands surrendered their heat the moment the sun dropped below the horizon. The sudden temperature plunge shocked the accountant's battered system. He stumbled on the cracked concrete of the loading ramp, his ruined knees buckling. He pitched forward, bracing for the harsh impact of the pavement. Brill Wingfield caught him by the collar. He did not grunt with the effort. He simply arrested the man's fall with one hand, hauling Julian upright and shoving him toward the deep shadows cast by a stack of wooden shipping pallets. "Stay low," Brill commanded. Julian folded into a tight, shivering ball behind the rotting wood. He clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his good eyes shut. Sweeping the suppressed Mk-23 pistol across the dark expanse of the compound, Brill evaluated the perimeter. The slaughterhouse sat in the center of a 2-acre dirt lot. A 12-foot chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire, surrounded the property. 4 heavy halogen floodlights mounted on wooden telephone poles bathed the center of the yard in a harsh, sodium-yellow glare, leaving the edges pooled in thick, impenetrable blackness. To the north, a row of corrugated metal barracks housed the off-shift sicarios. To the south, a motor pool contained a half-dozen battered pickup trucks and a single pristine, matte black Ford Raptor. The Raptor was the objective. Lifted suspension, heavy-duty off-road tires, reinforced steel push bumper. A vehicle built for the punishing terrain of the borderlands. Brill calculated the distance. 40 yards of open, illuminated dirt between the pallets and the motor pool. A sharp electronic screech shattered the quiet. The primary perimeter klaxon. The sound was a physical assault, a high-decibel wail that echoed off the distant canyon walls. Someone had entered the meat freezer. Someone had found the bodies. Floodlights attached to the barracks snapped on, cutting blinding white cones through the dark. The corrugated metal doors banged open. Men poured into the dirt yard. They were half-dressed, shouting over the deafening siren, racking the charging handles of assault rifles. Confusion reigned, but cartel discipline was brutal and efficient. The mob quickly organized into 2-man sweep teams, fanning out toward the main processing building. "They know," Julian whimpered, his voice barely audible over the klaxon. He pressed his face against the dirt. "They're going to skin us alive. My God. We're dead." Brill ignored the panic. He scanned the immediate environment, searching for an exploitable variable. 50 feet to his left, leaning against the exterior cinderblock wall of the slaughterhouse, sat an open-air maintenance bay. A rusted corrugated tin roof sheltered a collection of stripped engine blocks, oily rags, and a heavy-duty welding cart. Beside the cart stood a massive 1,000-gallon industrial propane tank, its white cylindrical hull stained with red dust. Brill holstered the Mk-23. "Do not move until I pull you," Brill said. He didn't wait for Julian to acknowledge the order. Slipping out from behind the wooden pallets, Brill melted into the deep shadow hugging the foundation of the building. He moved with liquid grace, his soft-soled boots utterly silent on the gravel. He reached the maintenance bay just as the first 2-man sweep team rounded the far corner of the slaughterhouse, their flashlight beams sweeping the loading dock. Crouching beside the welding cart, Brill grabbed the oxyacetylene torch. He cracked the dual valves, listening to the sharp hiss of the pressurized gas. Striking a flint igniter across the nozzle, he brought the torch to life. A brilliant, dagger-like flame of blue-white fire erupted from the tip. He did not dial the flame down. He opened the valves completely, turning the torch into a roaring, miniature jet engine. Stepping to the massive propane tank, Brill wedged the burning torch between the heavy steel belly of the cylinder and a cracked concrete cinder block. The blue flame licked directly against the pressurized metal hull. He reached up to the main brass bleed valve on the top of the tank. He wrenched it open. A thick, heavy cloud of raw propane immediately began to vent, spilling down the sides of the white cylinder like invisible water, pooling in the dirt bay. The smell was overpowering, a foul, artificial stench of rotten eggs masking the highly explosive vapor. The steel hull of the tank began to pop and ping, the metal stressing under the intense, localized heat of the welding torch. Brill turned and sprinted back through the shadows. He reached the shipping pallets. Grabbing the collar of Julian's shredded dress shirt, Brill hauled the accountant to his feet. "Run," Brill ordered. He shoved Julian toward a thick, reinforced concrete retaining wall, situated halfway between the loading dock and the motor pool. Julian stumbled, his legs functioning purely on raw terror. He hit the dirt behind the concrete barrier, gasping for air. Brill dropped to a knee beside him. He drew the Mk-23. The two-man sweep team reached the loading dock. The point man caught the overpowering stench of the venting propane. He lowered his rifle, shining his flashlight toward the maintenance bay. The beam illuminated the thick, shimmering haze of gas pooling around the white tank. "Gas?" the point man shouted in Spanish, turning to run. "Get back." He was 3 seconds too late. Brill aimed the suppressed pistol at the brass pressure relief valve on the top of the 1,000-gallon tank. He squeezed the trigger. The .45 caliber round shattered the brass fitting. The internal pressure of the tank failed catastrophically. The remaining liquid propane boiled instantly, expanding into a massive vapor cloud that immediately found the roaring blue flame of the welding torch. A boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. The resulting blast defied description. It was not merely a sound, it was a seismic event. The night tore open, replaced by a blinding, expanding sphere of pure incandescent orange fire. The shockwave hit a fraction of a second later. It struck the concrete retaining wall with the force of a freight train, compressing Brill's lungs and driving all the oxygen from the immediate atmosphere. The heat wash followed, instantly singeing the hair on the back of his hands and baking the cold desert air into a suffocating furnace. The maintenance bay evaporated. The corrugated tin roof shredded into razor-sharp shrapnel, riding the blast wave across the compound. The two Sicarios on the loading dock were vaporized, consumed by the expanding fireball before their nervous systems could register pain. The shockwave swept across the dirt lot, knocking the remaining guards to the ground, shattering every window in the barracks, and plunging the compound into complete chaos. The siren died, its wiring incinerated. "Up," Brill commanded. Deafened by the explosion, Julian only saw the ghost's lips move. He felt the iron grip on his arm, dragging him to his feet. The compound was a nightmare of swirling dust, secondary fires, and screaming men. Burning debris rained down on the dirt lot. Thick black smoke rolled across the ground, choking the remaining halogen floodlights. Brill used the smoke. Guiding the accountant, Brill cut a direct vector across the yard toward the motor pool. Sicarios staggered through the haze, blinded by the flash, their eardrums ruptured. They bumped into each other, firing wild, uncoordinated bursts into the dark. Reaching the matte black Ford Raptor, Brill found a lone guard leaning against the driver's side door. The man was bleeding from his nose and ears, concussed by the blast wave, his assault rifle hanging loosely from its sling. Crossing the final 10 feet, Brill did not break stride. He drove the heavy steel frame of the Mk-23 directly into the guard's temple. The man's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled against the oversized tire of the truck, sliding into the dirt. Brill ripped the key fob from a carabiner clipped to the unconscious man's belt. Opening the passenger door, Brill shoved the accountant inside. He rounded the hood, sliding behind the steering wheel. The leather interior smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. He depressed the brake and hit the ignition button. The heavily modified V8 engine roared to life, a deep aggressive growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Brill dropped the transmission into gear. He did not turn on the headlights. Standing on the accelerator, he spun the heavy steering wheel. The Raptor's all-terrain tires bit into the dirt, launching the 3-ton truck forward. He aimed directly for the heavy chain-link perimeter gate. Two Sicarios emerged from the smoke, stepping into the path of the speeding truck. They raised their rifles. Brill did not swerve. He kept his foot planted on the floor. The heavy steel push bumper of the Raptor struck the men at 40 miles an hour, launching them into the darkness like broken dolls. A split second later, the truck hit the perimeter gate. The reinforced locking mechanism sheared under the kinetic impact. The chain-link doors blew outward, screeching as they scraped across the desert floor. They were out. The Raptor tore onto a rutted dirt highway, leaving the burning slaughterhouse behind. Brill pushed the truck to 70 miles an hour, navigating purely by the ambient moonlight reflecting off the pale desert dust. The suspension absorbed the brutal craters and washboards of the unmaintained road with engineered precision. In the passenger seat, Julian Reed curled into a fetal position. He hugged his knees to his chest, trembling violently. He stared out the window, at the vast empty blackness of the Sonoran desert rushing past. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard, stripping away the numbness and leaving only the raw, bleeding edge of his trauma. "We made it," Julian gasped, his voice breaking. He looked across the dark cab, at the silhouette of the man driving. He desperately needed validation. He needed someone to tell him the nightmare was over. "My God. You blew the whole place up. You saved me. We're safe now, right? They can't follow us in the dark." Brill Wingfield did not offer reassurance. He did not celebrate the escape. His eyes constantly flicked between the pitch-black road ahead and the rearview mirrors. He monitored the engine temperature, gauged the fuel reserves, and calculated the intercept angles of the surrounding terrain. The slaughterhouse was merely the staging area. The cartel possessed limitless resources, deep corruption, and an absolute mandate to recover the accountant. "Put your seatbelt on," Brill said, his voice a cold, dead weight in the dark cabin. Julian stared at him, the desperate hope dying in his throat. He fumbled blindly for the buckle, the metallic click echoing loudly over the hum of the tires. "Why?" Julian whispered. Brill adjusted the rearview mirror, locking his dark eyes on the reflection of the road behind them. "Because the hunt just started," Brill said. Chapter 3. The twin-turbocharged V6 engine hurled the 3-ton Ford Raptor through the black desert. Heavy, aggressive tread bit into the rutted dirt highway, throwing up a massive, billowing wake of pale dust. Inside the cab, the climate control blasted hot air, fighting the freezing draft leaking through the bullet holes in the tailgate. Julian Reed curled tighter into the passenger side footwell. He pressed his bruised face against the thick rubber floor mats, smelling the factory-new rubber mingling with the metallic stench of his own dried blood. Every violent jolt of the suspension sent a fresh wave of agony through his battered ribs. He didn't look out the window. The absolute, suffocating darkness of the Sonoran Badlands offered no comfort. Sitting perfectly upright behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, Brill Wingfield drove with cold, mechanical precision. He kept both hands locked at 10 and 2. The dashboard illumination was dialed down to a faint, ghostly blue, preserving his night vision. He navigated the treacherous, cratered road, using only the sweeping beams of the truck's LED headlights and the pale ambient glow of a sliver moon. He checked the rear-view mirror. 2 distinct pairs of headlights had materialized in the distance, cutting sharp, erratic cones through the dust cloud trailing the Raptor. "Company," Brill said. The single word fell into the dark cab like a stone. Julian scrambled up, grabbing the edge of the leather seat. He peered over the dashboard, his good eye widening as he stared at the side mirror. The bouncing lights were gaining ground, closing the gap with terrifying speed. "They found us," Julian gasped, the raw panic returning to his throat. "How did they find us so fast?" "They didn't find us," Brill corrected, his eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. "They followed the blast radius. We left a burning slaughterhouse behind us. A beacon draws moths." He evaluated the telemetry of the chase. The Ford Raptor was a heavy, armored beast, designed to absorb punishment and power through obstacles. But the sheer weight compromised its top-end speed on an unpaved, winding desert track. The vehicles behind them were lighter, agile. Observing the narrow spread of the headlights and the aggressive, bouncing suspension, Brill identified the pursuit. Toyota Helix pickups. Stripped down. The preferred technicals of the border cartels. They carried less armor and more speed. "Can we outrun them?" Julian asked, his voice trembling as the trailing lights grew larger in the mirrors. "No," Brill said. "Then push the gas," Julian yelled, the corporate veneer completely shattering. "Drive faster. They're going to kill us." A heavy, rhythmic thumping sound echoed across the desert floor, audible even over the roar of the Raptor's engine. Thud, 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 thud. Sparks showered across the steel-reinforced tailgate of the Raptor. The heavy truck shuddered, absorbing massive kinetic impacts. "Get lower," Brill commanded. He didn't flinch as the rear windshield shattered into a million opaque cubes of tempered glass. The heavy window tint held the fragments together, preventing them from spraying into the cab, but the structural integrity was gone. "What is that?" Julian screamed, burying his face in his hands, pressing himself flat against the floorboards. "What are they shooting?" "Soviet-era DSHK," Brill analyzed, identifying the heavy, deliberate cadence of the weapon. A 12.7 mm heavy machine gun, mounted in the bed of the lead truck. Another burst of heavy-caliber fire hammered the rear of the Raptor. A round punched clean through the reinforced tailgate, tore through the rear passenger seat, and embedded itself in the center console with a deafening crack. Plastic shrapnel showered Brill's right arm. He ignored the debris. The armor plating woven into the Raptor's chassis would stop small arms fire, but it could not sustain a prolonged barrage from a heavy machine gun. Armor-piercing rounds would eventually find the engine block, the fuel tank, or the passengers. Running was no longer a viable tactical option. The environment demanded a counterattack. Brill scanned the terrain, illuminated by the headlights. The dirt highway carved a jagged path through a landscape of towering saguaro cacti, jagged limestone outcroppings, and deep dry washes carved by flash floods. He needed a choke point. 2 miles ahead, the road curved sharply to the left, hugging the edge of a massive, plunging arroyo. The dry riverbed dropped 40 feet into a ravine of jagged rock and compacted sand. It was a natural anvil. Brill just needed to drop the hammer. "Hold on to the seat," Brill told the trembling accountant. He reached toward the dashboard. He did not engage the four-wheel drive. He did not hit the accelerator. He twisted the headlight dial all the way to the left. The LED beams died instantly. The taillights extinguished. The Ford Raptor plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, traveling at 80 miles an hour over a broken dirt road. Julian let out a high, ragged shriek, entirely convinced they were about to launch off a cliff into the void. Brill operated purely on spatial memory, and the faint silver moonlight reflecting off the pale desert dust. He held the steering wheel steady, absorbing the violent impacts of the ruts through his forearms. He counted the seconds, calculating the distance to the arroyo curve based on his velocity. Behind them, the sudden blackout created instant tactical confusion for the cartel drivers. Tracking the bright red taillights of the Raptor had been their only visual anchor in the swirling dust. With the lights gone, they were driving blind into a thick, impenetrable cloud of particulate matter. The heavy machine gun ceased firing. The cartel driver didn't hit the brakes. Assuming the Raptor was still accelerating away in the dark, the lead helix surged forward, pushing through the dust cloud to reacquire the target. They were speeding directly into a snare. Brill reached the apex of the curve. The black void of the arroyo opened up to his right, a massive invisible drop-off. He hit the brakes. He didn't feather the pedal. He stomped it to the floorboards, engaging the anti-lock braking system. The massive, heavy-duty brake calipers clamped down on the slotted rotors. The 3-ton truck decelerated with violent, neck-snapping force. The heavy off-road tires locked, digging deep trenches into the dirt, sliding sideways toward the edge of the ravine. Brill controlled the skid with surgical precision. He turned the steering wheel into the slide, letting the kinetic energy bleed off, bringing the Raptor to a dead sliding halt mere inches from the crumbling edge of the 40-foot drop. Thick, choking dust immediately enveloped the stationary truck. Reaching into his tactical rig, Brill drew the suppressed Mk-23 pistol. He hit the power window switch. The glass dropped, letting the freezing desert air and the taste of pulverized dirt rush into the cab. He rested his right forearm on the window ledge, extending the heavy black pistol into the night. He did not close his left eye. He kept both eyes open, staring into the swirling gray cloud behind them, waiting for the trap to spring. The roar of a high-revving engine tore through the dust. The lead helix emerged from the cloud traveling at 70 miles an hour, its high beams blazing. The driver, expecting a clear straight road, suddenly found the massive black bulk of the Ford Raptor parked horizontally across the dirt highway, blocking the entire lane. The cartel driver panicked. He locked his brakes, twisting the steering wheel in a desperate attempt to avoid a catastrophic collision. The helix went into a chaotic, uncontrollable spin. The mounted heavy machine gun swung wildly in the truck bed, the gunner screaming as the centrifugal force threatened to throw him out. The spinning truck slid sideways, tires smoking, hurtling directly toward the front bumper of the stationary Raptor. Brill did not brace for impact. He found his target. As the driver's side window of the spinning helix rotated into his line of sight, illuminated by the ambient glow of the headlights, Brill squeezed the trigger. PFF'd. The heavy .45 caliber hollow point round shattered the side glass. It struck the cartel driver perfectly in the temple, exiting through the passenger side window in a spray of dark fluid. The driver died instantly, his foot slipping off the brake pedal and slamming down onto the accelerator in a final, involuntary muscular contraction. The sudden surge of power, combined with the locked steering column, altered the trajectory of the sliding truck. It missed the front bumper of the Raptor by less than 2 feet. The helix launched off the crumbling edge of the dirt highway. It hung suspended in the air for a fraction of a second, the headlights illuminating the empty black void of the arroyo. Then gravity took hold. The truck plummeted 40 feet, smashing nose first into the jagged limestone boulders at the bottom of the ravine. The impact crushed the engine block, collapsing the cab and instantly killing the gunner in the bed. The ambush was only half complete. The second pursuit vehicle, trailing entirely too close in the dust cloud, emerged a second later. The driver saw the taillights of the lead truck disappear over the cliff edge. He saw the black Raptor parked across the road. He hit the brakes, but the momentum was too great. The second helix slid on the loose gravel, tires locked, screeching toward the edge of the arroyo. The truck careened over the drop-off, tumbling end over end into the dark. It crashed directly on top of the ruined wreckage of the first truck. The violent impact ruptured the auxiliary fuel tanks mounted in the bed of the second helix. The spilling gasoline found the superheated exhaust manifold of the crushed engine block below. Ignition was instantaneous. A massive, roaring fireball erupted from the bottom of the ravine, rising 40 feet into the air, illuminating the desert for miles in a brilliant, violent wash of orange and yellow light. The shockwave rattled the windows of the Raptor, throwing a wave of intense heat across Brill's face. The heavy machine gun ammunition cooking off in the fire created a chaotic popping rhythm, sending stray tracers shooting wildly into the night sky like a deranged fireworks display. Brill lowered the Mk-23. He engaged the safety and holstered the weapon. He hit the button to roll the window up, sealing out the noise and the heat. He reached toward the dashboard, turning the dial. The LED headlights snapped back on, cutting a stark white path down the empty dirt road ahead. He shifted the transmission into drive. Julian Reed slowly lifted his head from the floorboards. He peered over the edge of the leather seat, staring out the shattered rear window. A towering column of black smoke and fire raged in the ravine behind them, painting the desert in the colors of hell. The twisted, burning husks of the two pursuit vehicles were indistinguishable from each other, reduced to a single pyre of twisted metal and incinerated flesh. The accountant looked back at the driver's seat. Brill Wingfield had not changed his expression. His pulse had not elevated. He did not look back at the destruction he had orchestrated. He simply pressed his boot against the accelerator, steering the heavy truck away from the fire and back into the freezing dark. "They're gone," Julian whispered, the words trembling on his lips. He was staring at Brill not with gratitude, but with a profound, paralyzing realization. He had survived the cartel. He had survived the abattoir. But as the Raptor rolled steadily deeper into the Sonoran Badlands, Julian understood he was trapped in a small, enclosed space with something far more dangerous than the men burning in the ditch. Brill didn't reply. He watched the dirt road, scanning the shadows, driving the ghost ship deeper into the night. Chapter 4. The Ford Raptor surrendered exactly 12 miles from the burning wreckage in the Arroyo. Armor-piercing rounds from the cartel's heavy machine gun had missed the engine block during the highway ambush, but a single, stray-jacketed bullet had punched a ragged hole through the heavy-duty aluminum radiator. Navigating a treacherous boulder-strewn dry wash deep in the Sonoran Badlands, the temperature gauge pinned itself permanently into the red. Hissing with violent dying pressure, a thick plume of acrid white steam erupted from beneath the crumpled hood. Smelling of scorched antifreeze and superheated metal, the massive twin-turbocharged V8 engine choked, shuddered violently against its mounts, and seized. The heavy truck rolled to a dead halt, settling into the loose, powdery sand of the wash. Absolute crushing silence immediately swallowed the cab, broken only by the sharp, metallic pinging of the rapidly cooling exhaust manifolds. Sitting in the passenger seat, Julian Reed stared through the cracked, dust-coated windshield at the plume of steam rising into the pale moonlight. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and raspy. He gripped his knees, rocking slightly, a man whose mind was desperately trying to reject the reality of his physical environment. Brill Wingfield did not hit the steering wheel in frustration. He did not curse the mechanical failure. An engine was a tool. When a tool broke, you discarded it and found another way to solve the problem. Killing the useless ignition, Brill unbuckled his harness. "Out," he commanded, kicking his door open and stepping onto the soft sand. Reaching behind the front seats, Brill systematically stripped the disabled Raptor of every usable asset. He secured 3 plastic bottles of lukewarm water, a rudimentary emergency medical kit housed in a red plastic shell, and a heavy-duty maritime flare gun from the truck's emergency supply box. He shoved the items into his canvas duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder alongside the captured Kalashnikov rifle he had taken from the slaughterhouse. Julian tumbled out of the passenger side, his legs giving way the moment his ruined leather dress shoes hit the uneven ground. He caught himself against the dusty quarter panel of the truck, gasping for air that tasted of dry alkali dust and hot engine oil. "We can't stop here," Julian wheezed, his good eye darting wildly across the jagged silhouettes of the surrounding limestone cliffs. "They have helicopters, don't they? Cartels have helicopters. If we stay by the truck, they'll find us." "We are not staying by the truck," Brill said. Turning his back on the smoking vehicle, Brill evaluated the topography. The dry wash carved a serpentine path through the base of a towering, monolithic ridge of dark rock. Decades of flash floods had scoured the canyon walls, exposing striated layers of ancient sediment. Pointing toward a narrow, treacherous switchback trail winding up the face of the ridge, Brill established the vector. "We climb," he said. The hike was an exercise in pure, unadulterated agony for the accountant. Stripped of his corporate ecosystem, Julian was entirely unequipped for the hostile brutality of the Sonoran Desert. The ground was not dirt, but a treacherous mixture of loose shale, compacted sandstone, and sharp, brittle limestone that shredded the thin leather soles of his Italian loafers. Every plant they passed bristled with hostile intent. Chala cactus spines snagged the torn fabric of his dress pants, leaving painful barbed needles buried deep in his calves. Ocotillo branches whipped against his bruised face in the dark. Brill moved ahead, setting a relentless, punishing pace. He navigated the switchbacks with the sure-footed silence of a predator, his dark combat boots finding secure purchase on the loose rock. He did not offer a hand to help Julian over the boulders. He did not slow down when the accountant stumbled and scraped his palms bloody on the sandstone. I need a minute," Julian gasped, collapsing onto a flat slab of rock halfway up the ridge. Clutching his chest, the accountant dry heaved, his body depleted of moisture and running entirely on the toxic fumes of residual adrenaline. His face, visible in the moonlight, was a pale, sickening shade of gray beneath the grime and dried blood. Stopping 10 feet above him on the trail, Brill looked down. "A minute costs distance," Brill stated, his voice devoid of any empathetic resonance. "Distance is the only currency keeping you alive. Stand up." "I can't," Julian sobbed, the tears cutting fresh tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "My chest, it feels like it's going to explode. I think my ribs are broken. From the slaughterhouse. When they kicked me." "If your ribs were broken, you would not be able to draw enough breath to complain about them," Brill analyzed, turning back to the trail. "They are bruised. Pain is a neurological signal. Ignore it. Move." Driven more by the terrifying prospect of being left alone in the dark than by any remaining physical strength, Julian forced himself to his feet. He staggered upward, following the ghost into the higher elevations. An hour later, nearing the crest of the ridge, the canyon wall deepened into a concave shadow. Brill stopped, raising a hand. Hewn directly into the sheer rock face, a jagged rectangular opening yawned into absolute blackness. Rusted, century-old iron ore cart tracks emerged from the mouth of the tunnel, terminating abruptly at the edge of the cliff. It was a 19th-century silver mine. Abandoned, forgotten, and entirely off the grid. Stepping into the mouth of the tunnel, Brill crossed an invisible threshold. The transition was violent. The lingering, arid chill of the open desert vanished, replaced instantly by the profound, stagnant cold of subterranean earth. The air inside the mine felt heavy, smelling strongly of oxidized copper, pulverized limestone, and decades of undisturbed dust. Julian stumbled in behind him, shivering violently as the cavernous cold penetrated his shredded, sweat-soaked dress shirt. "Keep your hand on the rock wall," Brill instructed, retrieving a small, red-lens penlight from his tactical rig. The narrow beam of crimson light cut a weak path through the pitch-black tunnel. Heavy timber supports, petrified by the dry air, lined the ceiling, bowed slightly under the immense weight of the mountain above. Moving 50 yards deep into the primary shaft, Brill found what he needed. The tunnel widened into a large, excavated staging cavern. Remnants of the old mining operation littered the floor, rusted iron buckets, decaying coils of hemp rope, and a massive fractured wooden spool. "Sit," Brill ordered, pointing the red beam toward a flat shelf of solid rock near the back wall of the cavern. Julian didn't sit, he collapsed. He hit the stone shelf hard, drawing his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins in a desperate attempt to conserve his failing body heat. His teeth chattered loudly, the sound echoing off the curved stone walls. Ignoring the shivering man, Brill went to work. A secure hide required concentric rings of defense. Setting his duffel bag down, he extracted a spool of high-tensile, transparent monofilament fishing line. He walked back down the tunnel, stopping 20 yards from the cavern entrance, selecting a narrow choke point where the rock walls pinched tightly together. Tying one end of the monofilament to a rusted iron spike, driven into the timber support, Brill pulled the wire taut across the corridor, securing the other end a mere 6 inches off the ground. Invisible in the dark, it was a perfect tripwire. Returning to the cavern, he picked up a discarded, heavy glass bottle left behind by prospectors a century ago. He wrapped the thick glass in a piece of burlap sack he found rotting near an ore cart. Using the heavy steel butt of his Mk-23 pistol, he struck the wrapped bundle sharply, shattering the bottle into jagged, irregular pieces without making a loud crash. He carefully sprinkled the crushed glass across the stone floor, immediately beyond the tripwire. What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Establishing an acoustic perimeter," Brill replied, emptying the last of the glass dust from the burlap. "A boot crushing glass creates a distinct acoustic signature. A falling body creates another. It buys us 3 seconds of warning." "Warning from who?" Julian pleaded, his panic escalating as the reality of their isolation sank in. "We left them miles away. They can't track us over rocks in the dark." "Professional trackers do not need footprints," Brill said, walking back into the staging cavern. "They look for disturbed gravel, broken chala spines, scuff marks on limestone. The men hunting you are funded by a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor. They will not send local cartel thugs to finish the job. They will send professionals." Sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor near the center of the cavern, Brill unslung the captured Kalashnikov. "I need a doctor," Julian wheezed, clutching his stomach. "I'm severely dehydrated. My urine was brown yesterday. My kidneys are going to fail. We need to find a town. A clinic." "Hospitals have registries," Brill stated, ejecting the magazine from the rifle. "Registries require names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. That data enters a centralized network. The men hunting you monitor those networks. Entering a hospital is requesting a highly publicized execution. I am going to die in this cave." Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. The outburst echoed loudly in the confined space, bouncing off the walls, harsh and desperate. Brill did not look up. He pulled back the charging handle of the Kalashnikov, inspecting the chamber in the dim red glow of his penlight. Satisfied the weapon was clear, he set it aside and began emptying the pockets of his tactical rig. He laid out his spare magazines for the Mk-23, a combat tourniquet, the maritime flare gun, and a specialized mapping GPS device. His movements were hypnotic in their symmetry and efficiency. He was a machine running a diagnostic check. "You are experiencing stage 2 hemorrhagic shock from the beatings, compounded by severe environmental dehydration," Brill diagnosed, his voice a flat clinical drone. "Your heart rate is elevated, your extremities are cold, and your cognitive functions are degrading due to panic." Reaching into the canvas duffel bag, Brill retrieved one of the plastic water bottles he had stripped from the truck. He unscrewed the cap and tossed it underhand. The bottle landed squarely in Julian's lap. "Drink a quarter of that," Brill instructed. "If you drink it all at once, your stomach will reject it, you will vomit, and you will accelerate your dehydration." Julian grabbed the plastic bottle with trembling hands, raising it to his cracked lips. He took a small sip, the lukewarm liquid burning his raw throat. He wanted to drain the entire container, but the cold authority in Brill's voice stayed his hand. He lowered the bottle, gripping it like a lifeline. "What happens tomorrow?" Julian asked, his voice a pathetic whisper. Brill picked up a loaded magazine, slapping it firmly into the well of the Mk-23 pistol. The sharp, metallic clack sounded like a judge's gavel dropping in the dark cavern. "Tomorrow," Brill said, his eyes scanning the pitch-black tunnel leading back out to the desert, "the sun comes up, and the environment becomes our primary enemy." He engaged the safety on the pistol, resting the heavy weapon on his thigh. "Sleep," Brill commanded. He clicked off the red penlight, plunging the silver mine into absolute profound blackness. Julian Reed squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the drip of condensation somewhere deep in the mountain, utterly terrified of the silence, and even more terrified of the ghost sitting perfectly still in the dark beside him. Chapter 5. The Ford Raptor surrendered exactly 12 miles from the burning wreckage in the arroyo. Armor-piercing rounds from the cartel's heavy machine gun had missed the engine block during the highway ambush, but a single, stray-jacketed bullet had punched a ragged hole through the heavy-duty aluminum radiator. Navigating a treacherous boulder-strewn dry wash deep in the Sonoran Badlands, the temperature gauge pinned itself permanently into the red. Hissing with violent dying pressure, a thick plume of acrid white steam erupted from beneath the crumpled hood. Smelling of scorched antifreeze and superheated metal, the massive twin-turbocharged V8 engine choked, shuddered violently against its mounts, and seized. The heavy truck rolled to a dead halt, settling into the loose, powdery sand of the wash. Absolute crushing silence immediately swallowed the cab, broken only by the sharp, metallic pinging of the rapidly cooling exhaust manifolds. Sitting in the passenger seat, Julian Reed stared through the cracked, dust-coated windshield at the plume of steam rising into the pale moonlight. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and raspy. He gripped his knees, rocking slightly, a man whose mind was desperately trying to reject the reality of his physical environment. Brill Wingfield did not hit the steering wheel in frustration. He did not curse the mechanical failure. An engine was a tool. When a tool broke, you discarded it and found another way to solve the problem. Killing the useless ignition, Brill unbuckled his harness. "Out," he commanded, kicking his door open and stepping onto the soft sand. Reaching behind the front seats, Brill systematically stripped the disabled Raptor of every usable asset. He secured 3 plastic bottles of lukewarm water, a rudimentary emergency medical kit housed in a red plastic shell, and a heavy-duty maritime flare gun from the truck's emergency supply box. He shoved the items into his canvas duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder alongside the captured Kalashnikov rifle he had taken from the slaughterhouse. Julian tumbled out of the passenger side, his legs giving way the moment his ruined leather dress shoes hit the uneven ground. He caught himself against the dusty quarter panel of the truck, gasping for air that tasted of dry alkali dust and hot engine oil. "We can't stop here," Julian wheezed, his good eye darting wildly across the jagged silhouettes of the surrounding limestone cliffs. "They have helicopters, don't they? Cartels have helicopters. If we stay by the truck, they'll find us." "We are not staying by the truck," Brill said. Turning his back on the smoking vehicle, Brill evaluated the topography. The dry wash carved a serpentine path through the base of a towering, monolithic ridge of dark rock. Decades of flash floods had scoured the canyon walls, exposing striated layers of ancient sediment. Pointing toward a narrow, treacherous switchback trail winding up the face of the ridge, Brill established the vector. "We climb," he said. The hike was an exercise in pure, unadulterated agony for the accountant. Stripped of his corporate ecosystem, Julian was entirely unequipped for the hostile brutality of the Sonoran Desert. The ground was not dirt, but a treacherous mixture of loose shale, compacted sandstone, and sharp, brittle limestone that shredded the thin leather soles of his Italian loafers. Every plant they passed bristled with hostile intent. Chala cactus spines snagged the torn fabric of his dress pants, leaving painful barbed needles buried deep in his calves. Ocotillo branches whipped against his bruised face in the dark. Brill moved ahead, setting a relentless, punishing pace. He navigated the switchbacks with the sure-footed silence of a predator, his dark combat boots finding secure purchase on the loose rock. He did not offer a hand to help Julian over the boulders. He did not slow down when the accountant stumbled and scraped his palms bloody on the sandstone. I need a minute," Julian gasped, collapsing onto a flat slab of rock halfway up the ridge. Clutching his chest, the accountant dry heaved, his body depleted of moisture and running entirely on the toxic fumes of residual adrenaline. His face, visible in the moonlight, was a pale, sickening shade of gray beneath the grime and dried blood. Stopping 10 feet above him on the trail, Brill looked down. "A minute costs distance," Brill stated, his voice devoid of any empathetic resonance. "Distance is the only currency keeping you alive. Stand up." "I can't," Julian sobbed, the tears cutting fresh tracks through the dust on his cheeks. My chest, it feels like it's going to explode. I think my ribs are broken. From the slaughterhouse. When they kicked me. If your ribs were broken, you would not be able to draw enough breath to complain about them, Brill analyzed, turning back to the trail. They are bruised. Pain is a neurological signal. Ignore it. Move. Driven more by the terrifying prospect of being left alone in the dark than by any remaining physical strength, Julian forced himself to his feet. He staggered upward, following the ghost into the higher elevations. An hour later, nearing the crest of the ridge, the canyon wall deepened into a concave shadow. Brill stopped, raising a hand. Hewn directly into the sheer rock face, a jagged rectangular opening yawned into absolute blackness. Rusted, century-old iron ore cart tracks emerged from the mouth of the tunnel, terminating abruptly at the edge of the cliff. It was a 19th-century silver mine. Abandoned, forgotten, and entirely off the grid. Stepping into the mouth of the tunnel, Brill crossed an invisible threshold. The transition was violent. The lingering arid chill of the open desert vanished, replaced instantly by the profound stagnant cold of subterranean earth. The air inside the mine felt heavy, smelling strongly of oxidized copper, pulverized limestone, and decades of undisturbed dust. Julian stumbled in behind him, shivering violently as the cavernous cold penetrated his shredded, sweat-soaked dress shirt. "Keep your hand on the rock wall," Brill instructed, retrieving a small, red-lens penlight from his tactical rig. The narrow beam of crimson light cut a weak path through the pitch-black tunnel. Heavy timber supports, petrified by the dry air, lined the ceiling, bowed slightly under the immense weight of the mountain above. Moving 50 yards deep into the primary shaft, Brill found what he needed. The tunnel widened into a large, excavated staging cavern. Remnants of the old mining operation littered the floor, rusted iron buckets, decaying coils of hemp rope, and a massive fractured wooden spool. "Sit," Brill ordered, pointing the red beam toward a flat shelf of solid rock near the back wall of the cavern. Julian didn't sit, he collapsed. He hit the stone shelf hard, drawing his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins in a desperate attempt to conserve his failing body heat. His teeth chattered loudly, the sound echoing off the curved stone walls. Ignoring the shivering man, Brill went to work. A secure hide required concentric rings of defense. Setting his duffel bag down, he extracted a spool of high-tensile, transparent monofilament fishing line. He walked back down the tunnel, stopping 20 yards from the cavern entrance, selecting a narrow choke point where the rock walls pinched tightly together. Tying one end of the monofilament to a rusted iron spike, driven into the timber support, Brill pulled the wire taut across the corridor, securing the other end a mere 6 inches off the ground. Invisible in the dark, it was a perfect tripwire. Returning to the cavern, he picked up a discarded, heavy glass bottle left behind by prospectors a century ago. He wrapped the thick glass in a piece of burlap sack he found rotting near an ore cart. Using the heavy steel butt of his Mk-23 pistol, he struck the wrapped bundle sharply, shattering the bottle into jagged, irregular pieces without making a loud crash. He carefully sprinkled the crushed glass across the stone floor, immediately beyond the tripwire. What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Establishing an acoustic perimeter," Brill replied, emptying the last of the glass dust from the burlap. "A boot crushing glass creates a distinct acoustic signature. A falling body creates another. It buys us 3 seconds of warning." "Warning from who?" Julian pleaded, his panic escalating as the reality of their isolation sank in. "We left them miles away. They can't track us over rocks in the dark." "Professional trackers do not need footprints," Brill said, walking back into the staging cavern. "They look for disturbed gravel, broken chala spines, scuff marks on limestone. The men hunting you are funded by a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor. They will not send local cartel thugs to finish the job. They will send professionals. Sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor near the center of the cavern, Brill unslung the captured Kalashnikov. "I need a doctor," Julian wheezed, clutching his stomach. "I'm severely dehydrated. My urine was brown yesterday. My kidneys are going to fail. We need to find a town. A clinic." "Hospitals have registries," Brill stated, ejecting the magazine from the rifle. "Registries require names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. That data enters a centralized network. The men hunting you monitor those networks. Entering a hospital is requesting a highly publicized execution. I am going to die in this cave." Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. The outburst echoed loudly in the confined space, bouncing off the walls, harsh and desperate. Brill did not look up. He pulled back the charging handle of the Kalashnikov, inspecting the chamber in the dim red glow of his penlight. Satisfied the weapon was clear, he set it aside and began emptying the pockets of his tactical rig. He laid out his spare magazines for the Mk-23, a combat tourniquet, the maritime flare gun, and a specialized mapping GPS device. His movements were hypnotic in their symmetry and efficiency. He was a machine running a diagnostic check. "You are experiencing stage 2 hemorrhagic shock from the beatings, compounded by severe environmental dehydration," Brill diagnosed, his voice a flat clinical drone. "Your heart rate is elevated, your extremities are cold, and your cognitive functions are degrading due to panic." Reaching into the canvas duffel bag, Brill retrieved one of the plastic water bottles he had stripped from the truck. He unscrewed the cap and tossed it underhand. The bottle landed squarely in Julian's lap. "Drink a quarter of that," Brill instructed. "If you drink it all at once, your stomach will reject it, you will vomit, and you will accelerate your dehydration." Julian grabbed the plastic bottle with trembling hands, raising it to his cracked lips. He took a small sip, the lukewarm liquid burning his raw throat. He wanted to drain the entire container, but the cold authority in Brill's voice stayed his hand. He lowered the bottle, gripping it like a lifeline. "What happens tomorrow?" Julian asked, his voice a pathetic whisper. Brill picked up a loaded magazine, slapping it firmly into the well of the Mk-23 pistol. The sharp, metallic clack sounded like a judge's gavel dropping in the dark cavern. "Tomorrow," Brill said, his eyes scanning the pitch-black tunnel leading back out to the desert, "the sun comes up, and the environment becomes our primary enemy." He engaged the safety on the pistol, resting the heavy weapon on his thigh. "Sleep," Brill commanded. He clicked off the red penlight, plunging the silver mine into absolute profound blackness. Julian Reed squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the drip of condensation somewhere deep in the mountain, utterly terrified of the silence, and even more terrified of the ghost sitting perfectly still in the dark beside him. Chapter 6. The Ford Raptor surrendered exactly 12 miles from the burning wreckage in the Arroyo. Armor-piercing rounds from the cartel's heavy machine gun had missed the engine block during the highway ambush, but a single, stray-jacketed bullet had punched a ragged hole through the heavy-duty aluminum radiator. Navigating a treacherous boulder-strewn dry wash deep in the Sonoran Badlands, the temperature gauge pinned itself permanently into the red. Hissing with violent dying pressure, a thick plume of acrid white steam erupted from beneath the crumpled hood. Smelling of scorched antifreeze and superheated metal, the massive twin-turbocharged V8 engine choked, shuddered violently against its mounts, and seized. The heavy truck rolled to a dead halt, settling into the loose, powdery sand of the wash. Absolute crushing silence immediately swallowed the cab, broken only by the sharp, metallic pinging of the rapidly cooling exhaust manifolds. Sitting in the passenger seat, Julian Reed stared through the cracked, dust-coated windshield at the plume of steam rising into the pale moonlight. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and raspy. He gripped his knees, rocking slightly, a man whose mind was desperately trying to reject the reality of his physical environment. Brill Wingfield, did not hit the steering wheel in frustration. He did not curse the mechanical failure. An engine was a tool. When a tool broke, you discarded it and found another way to solve the problem. Killing the useless ignition, Brill unbuckled his harness. "Out," he commanded, kicking his door open and stepping onto the soft sand. Reaching behind the front seats, Brill systematically stripped the disabled Raptor of every usable asset. He secured 3 plastic bottles of lukewarm water, a rudimentary emergency medical kit housed in a red plastic shell, and a heavy-duty maritime flare gun from the truck's emergency supply box. He shoved the items into his canvas duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder alongside the captured Kalashnikov rifle he had taken from the slaughterhouse. Julian tumbled out of the passenger side, his legs giving way the moment his ruined leather dress shoes hit the uneven ground. He caught himself against the dusty quarter panel of the truck, gasping for air that tasted of dry alkali dust and hot engine oil. "We can't stop here," Julian wheezed, his good eye darting wildly across the jagged silhouettes of the surrounding limestone cliffs. "They have helicopters, don't they? Cartels have helicopters. If we stay by the truck, they'll find us." "We are not staying by the truck," Brill said. Turning his back on the smoking vehicle, Brill evaluated the topography. The dry wash carved a serpentine path through the base of a towering, monolithic ridge of dark rock. Decades of flash floods had scoured the canyon walls, exposing striated layers of ancient sediment. Pointing toward a narrow, treacherous switchback trail winding up the face of the ridge, Brill established the vector. "We climb," he said. The hike was an exercise in pure, unadulterated agony for the accountant. Stripped of his corporate ecosystem, Julian was entirely unequipped for the hostile brutality of the Sonoran Desert. The ground was not dirt, but a treacherous mixture of loose shale, compacted sandstone, and sharp, brittle limestone that shredded the thin leather soles of his Italian loafers. Every plant they passed bristled with hostile intent. Chala cactus spines snagged the torn fabric of his dress pants, leaving painful barbed needles buried deep in his calves. Ocotillo branches whipped against his bruised face in the dark. Brill moved ahead, setting a relentless, punishing pace. He navigated the switchbacks with the sure-footed silence of a predator, his dark combat boots finding secure purchase on the loose rock. He did not offer a hand to help Julian over the boulders. He did not slow down when the accountant stumbled and scraped his palms bloody on the sandstone. I need a minute," Julian gasped, collapsing onto a flat slab of rock halfway up the ridge. Clutching his chest, the accountant dry heaved, his body depleted of moisture and running entirely on the toxic fumes of residual adrenaline. His face, visible in the moonlight, was a pale, sickening shade of gray beneath the grime and dried blood. Stopping 10 feet above him on the trail, Brill looked down. "A minute costs distance," Brill stated, his voice devoid of any empathetic resonance. "Distance is the only currency keeping you alive. Stand up." "I can't," Julian sobbed, the tears cutting fresh tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "My chest, it feels like it's going to explode. I think my ribs are broken. From the slaughterhouse. When they kicked me." "If your ribs were broken, you would not be able to draw enough breath to complain about them," Brill analyzed, turning back to the trail. "They are bruised. Pain is a neurological signal. Ignore it. Move." Driven more by the terrifying prospect of being left alone in the dark than by any remaining physical strength, Julian forced himself to his feet. He staggered upward, following the ghost into the higher elevations. An hour later, nearing the crest of the ridge, the canyon wall deepened into a concave shadow. Brill stopped, raising a hand. Hewn directly into the sheer rock face, a jagged rectangular opening yawned into absolute blackness. Rusted, century-old iron ore cart tracks emerged from the mouth of the tunnel, terminating abruptly at the edge of the cliff. It was a 19th-century silver mine. Abandoned, forgotten, and entirely off the grid. Stepping into the mouth of the tunnel, Brill crossed an invisible threshold. The transition was violent. The lingering, arid chill of the open desert vanished, replaced instantly by the profound, stagnant cold of subterranean earth. The air inside the mine felt heavy, smelling strongly of oxidized copper, pulverized limestone, and decades of undisturbed dust. Julian stumbled in behind him, shivering violently as the cavernous cold penetrated his shredded, sweat-soaked dress shirt. "Keep your hand on the rock wall," Brill instructed, retrieving a small, red-lens penlight from his tactical rig. The narrow beam of crimson light cut a weak path through the pitch-black tunnel. Heavy timber supports, petrified by the dry air, lined the ceiling, bowed slightly under the immense weight of the mountain above. Moving 50 yards deep into the primary shaft, Brill found what he needed. The tunnel widened into a large, excavated staging cavern. Remnants of the old mining operation littered the floor: rusted iron buckets, decaying coils of hemp rope, and a massive fractured wooden spool. "Sit," Brill ordered, pointing the red beam toward a flat shelf of solid rock near the back wall of the cavern. Julian didn't sit, he collapsed. He hit the stone shelf hard, drawing his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins in a desperate attempt to conserve his failing body heat. His teeth chattered loudly, the sound echoing off the curved stone walls. Ignoring the shivering man, Brill went to work. A secure hide required concentric rings of defense. Setting his duffel bag down, he extracted a spool of high-tensile, transparent monofilament fishing line. He walked back down the tunnel, stopping 20 yards from the cavern entrance, selecting a narrow choke point where the rock walls pinched tightly together. Tying one end of the monofilament to a rusted iron spike driven into the timber support, Brill pulled the wire taut across the corridor, securing the other end a mere 6 inches off the ground. Invisible in the dark, it was a perfect tripwire. Returning to the cavern, he picked up a discarded, heavy glass bottle left behind by prospectors a century ago. He wrapped the thick glass in a piece of burlap sack he found rotting near an ore cart. Using the heavy steel butt of his Mk-23 pistol, he struck the wrapped bundle sharply, shattering the bottle into jagged, irregular pieces without making a loud crash. He carefully sprinkled the crushed glass across the stone floor, immediately beyond the tripwire. What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Establishing an acoustic perimeter," Brill replied, emptying the last of the glass dust from the burlap. "A boot crushing glass creates a distinct acoustic signature. A falling body creates another. It buys us 3 seconds of warning." "Warning from who?" Julian pleaded, his panic escalating as the reality of their isolation sank in. "We left them miles away. They can't track us over rocks in the dark." "Professional trackers do not need footprints," Brill said, walking back into the staging cavern. "They look for disturbed gravel, broken chala spines, scuff marks on limestone. The men hunting you are funded by a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor. They will not send local cartel thugs to finish the job. They will send professionals." Sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor near the center of the cavern, Brill unslung the captured Kalashnikov. "I need a doctor," Julian wheezed, clutching his stomach. "I'm severely dehydrated. My urine was brown yesterday. My kidneys are going to fail. We need to find a town. A clinic." "Hospitals have registries," Brill stated, ejecting the magazine from the rifle. "Registries require names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. That data enters a centralized network. The men hunting you monitor those networks. Entering a hospital is requesting a highly publicized execution. I am going to die in this cave." Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. The outburst echoed loudly in the confined space, bouncing off the walls, harsh and desperate. Brill did not look up. He pulled back the charging handle of the Kalashnikov, inspecting the chamber in the dim red glow of his penlight. Satisfied the weapon was clear, he set it aside and began emptying the pockets of his tactical rig. He laid out his spare magazines for the Mk-23, a combat tourniquet, the maritime flare gun, and a specialized mapping GPS device. His movements were hypnotic in their symmetry and efficiency. He was a machine running a diagnostic check. You are experiencing stage 2 hemorrhagic shock from the beatings, compounded by severe environmental dehydration, Brill diagnosed, his voice a flat clinical drone. Your heart rate is elevated, your extremities are cold, and your cognitive functions are degrading due to panic. Reaching into the canvas duffel bag, Brill retrieved one of the plastic water bottles he had stripped from the truck. He unscrewed the cap and tossed it underhand. The bottle landed squarely in Julian's lap. "Drink a quarter of that," Brill instructed. "If you drink it all at once, your stomach will reject it, you will vomit, and you will accelerate your dehydration." Julian grabbed the plastic bottle with trembling hands, raising it to his cracked lips. He took a small sip, the lukewarm liquid burning his raw throat. He wanted to drain the entire container, but the cold authority in Brill's voice stayed his hand. He lowered the bottle, gripping it like a lifeline. "What happens tomorrow?" Julian asked, his voice a pathetic whisper. Brill picked up a loaded magazine, slapping it firmly into the well of the Mk-23 pistol. The sharp, metallic clack sounded like a judge's gavel dropping in the dark cavern. "Tomorrow," Brill said, his eyes scanning the pitch-black tunnel leading back out to the desert, "the sun comes up, and the environment becomes our primary enemy." He engaged the safety on the pistol, resting the heavy weapon on his thigh. "Sleep," Brill commanded. He clicked off the red pen light, plunging the silver mine into absolute profound blackness. Julian Reed squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the drip of condensation somewhere deep in the mountain, utterly terrified of the silence, and even more terrified of the ghost sitting perfectly still in the dark beside him. Chapter 7. A dense, caustic wave of military-grade CS gas rolled down the primary drift of the abandoned silver mine, a silent, expanding cloud of chemical fire. The heavy white vapor clung to the floor initially, pooling in the depressions before the ambient air currents caught it, dragging the toxic smoke deeper into the subterranean dark. It smelled of burning plastic and raw weaponized pepper. Brill Wingfield maintained a punishing, relentless pace. The narrow beam of his red penlight cut through the absolute blackness, illuminating jagged limestone walls and rotting timber supports. He did not look back at the accountant stumbling blindly behind him. "My lungs," Julian Reed gasped, a wet rattling sound tearing from his throat. "It's burning. I can't breathe." The vanguard of the gas cloud had not yet reached them, but the invisible pulverized particulate, traveling ahead of the main smoke plume, was already irritating the mucous membranes. Julian's good eyes streamed with involuntary tears. Saliva poured from his mouth. "Keep your head up," Brill instructed, his voice a flat, hollow echo in the tunnel. "CS particulate settles. The air is cleaner near the ceiling. Move." They pushed 100 yards deeper into the mountain. The air grew perceptibly thinner, losing the stagnant chill of the cavern and taking on a faint, dry warmth. Brill stopped abruptly. The horizontal drift terminated at a sheer wall of solid rock. To the left, a massive vertical shaft soared upward into the pitch-black void. Century-old iron brackets, oxidized into brittle flakes of rust, were driven into the stone at 3-foot intervals. A faint, steady current of warm air pulled upward through the chimney, a natural vacuum, drawing the atmosphere from the deep tunnels toward the desert surface. It was the updraft, the lungs of the dead mine. "We climb," Brill stated, aiming the red beam straight up the shaft. Julian collapsed against the tunnel wall, his chest heaving as a violent coughing fit seized him. The leading edge of the white smoke drifted into the base of the shaft, swirling around their ankles. The chemical burn was immediate and vicious. "I can't," Julian wheezed, sliding down the rough stone to his knees. "My hands are shredded. I don't have the strength. Just leave me. Let them take me." Brill stepped into the expanding white smoke. He did not cough. He did not rub his watering eyes. He grabbed the accountant by the collar of his ruined dress shirt and hauled him violently to his feet. Aegis Dynamics does not take prisoners, Brill said, shoving Julian against the base of the vertical shaft. Silas Croft pumped gas into a closed subterranean structure. He intends to suffocate you in the dark. Put your hand on the iron. Panic, raw and primal, finally overrode the accountant's exhaustion. Blinded by tears and choking on the caustic air, Julian reached up, his bleeding fingers finding the first rusted iron bracket. Pull, Brill commanded. The ascent was an exercise in pure, agonizing vertical geometry. Brill climbed directly beneath Julian, using his own body as a physical wedge to prevent the civilian from falling back into the gas. When Julian's grip faltered on the slick, decaying iron, Brill drove his shoulder upward into the accountant's boots, forcing him higher. The chimney was a claustrophobic pipe, barely 3 feet wide. The jagged rock walls tore at their clothing and scraped their skin raw. Below them, the CS gas pooled at the base of the shaft, a boiling white cauldron of poison slowly rising, drawn upward by the same draft that fueled their escape. "It's breaking," Julian sobbed, his weight tearing one of the ancient iron brackets loose from the stone. The metal groaned, showering them with a thick rain of rust and dirt. Julian slipped, dropping 3 feet in the darkness before Brill's hand shot out, clamping around the accountant's ankle in a vice grip. The sudden, jarring stop nearly dislocated Julian's knee. "Do not test the iron," Brill ordered, releasing the ankle and driving Julian upward again. "Find purchase on the stone. The rock does not break." They climbed for 20 minutes. The air growing warmer, the darkness losing its absolute crushing weight. Above them, a jagged circle of blinding, brilliant white light appeared. The transition from the subterranean void to the desert surface was a violent sensory assault. Julian breached the opening first, dragging his battered body over the lip of the chimney and collapsing onto the baking limestone. Brill vaulted over the edge a second later, immediately rolling away from the opening and drawing his Mk-23 pistol. They had emerged near the spine of the monolithic ridge. The mid-morning Sonoran sun was a brutal, unforgiving hammer, beating down upon the pale bleached rock. The ambient temperature, 45 degrees in the mine, was already cresting 90 on the surface. The glare was absolute. Julian lay on his back, gasping hungrily at the dry, baking air. His dress shirt was soaked in sweat and blood, his face a pale, bruised mask of utter depletion. Ignoring the heat, Brill moved to the edge of the ridge, dropping flat onto his stomach. He crawled forward, peering over the precipice. 400 feet below, the tactical situation unfolded with clinical precision. 3 black armored SUVs were parked in a defensive semicircle near the base of the switchback trail. A dozen operators in desert camo fatigues manned a secure perimeter. Near the mouth of the silver mine, 2 men wearing heavy olive-drab M50 gas masks stood by a portable compressor, feeding thick corrugated hoses into the dark tunnel. They were flooding the entire mountain structure with concentrated CS gas. Standing beside the SUVs, staring intently at a ruggedized field tablet, was a tall, lean man with close-cropped gray hair. Silas Croft. The ex-JSOC tracker was reviewing the topographical scans, waiting for his prey to flush out the front door. A high-pitched mechanical whine cut through the desert silence. Brill shifted his gaze upward. A sleek 4-rotor surveillance drone hovered 200 feet above the valley floor, its high-resolution optics systematically mapping the face of the ridge. "Get up," Brill said, sliding back from the precipice. Julian didn't move. He lay pinned to the baking rock, his eyes closed. "I need water. Please." "The drone is running a grid search," Brill stated, grabbing his canvas duffel bag. "It will complete its sweep of the lower elevations in 4 minutes. When it reaches the spine of this ridge, it will acquire our thermal signatures immediately. We have 0 concealment." Brill walked over and kicked the sole of Julian's ruined Italian loafer. Hard. Stand up, Brill ordered. Groaning, the accountant rolled onto his side, pushing himself up on bleeding, blistered hands. The brutal desert sun instantly began evaporating the sweat from his body, initiating the rapid, deadly cycle of environmental dehydration. "They're going to see us," Julian wheezed, staring at the barren, exposed plateau stretching out before them. There were no trees, no caves, just miles of sun-blasted rock and hostile, spiny ocotillo plants shimmering in the heat distortion. "Yes," Brill confirmed, confirming the grim reality without a trace of emotion. "They are." Turning away from the drop-off, Brill established a new vector. The spine of the ridge sloped downward toward the east, descending into a massive, twisting labyrinth of deep arroyos and jagged slot canyons carved by ancient floodwaters. It was a desolate lunar landscape, offering no shelter and no mercy. "Walk," Brill commanded, racking the slide of the Mk-23. "The mountain failed to kill us. Now we let the desert try." Julian staggered forward, an empty, broken vessel following a ghost into the inferno. Behind them, a thin, white wisp of toxic smoke curled lazily out of the ventilation chimney, dissolving instantly into the baking, indifferent sky. Chapter 8. The descent into the labyrinth of slot canyons was a slow, punishing degradation. Leaving the exposed spine of the ridge behind, Brill led them down a steep, treacherous scree slope composed entirely of loose, sun-baked shale. The rocks shattered and slid beneath their boots, sounding like breaking glass in the dead silence of the Badlands. Julian Reed did not walk. He surrendered to gravity. Stripped of his Italian loafers, his bleeding feet were bound in thick layers of torn fabric salvaged from his ruined dress shirt, secured clumsily with strips of duct tape from Brill's emergency kit. The makeshift bandages offered minimal protection against the jagged terrain. He slid on his backside down the steeper inclines, his hands raw and leaving faint bloody smears on the pale stone. "Keep your weight back," Brill instructed, navigating the slope with practiced fluid balance, the heavy Mk-23 pistol held securely against his chest. "Let the sliding rock carry you. Do not fight the momentum." "I can't," Julian gasped, his voice a dry, rasping wheeze that barely carried over the sound of sliding shale. "My legs, they won't hold." Reaching the bottom of the slope, they entered the mouth of a deep, twisting arroyo. Carved over millennia by flash floods, the dry wash was a serpentine trench of compacted sand and smooth, water-polished boulders. The canyon walls rose 50 feet on either side, striated with layers of ancient red sediment. It offered immediate concealment from the drone patrolling the higher elevations, but the confined space amplified the brutal, suffocating heat. The air was stagnant, baking in the trench like a clay oven. The ambient temperature, cresting 90 on the exposed ridge, was already pushing 100 in the windless canyon. Brill stopped, raising a hand. He unslung his canvas duffel bag, setting it down silently on the soft sand. He retrieved the captured medical kit and the 2 spare magazines he had taken from the dead scouts in the mine. Checking the action of the Mk-23, he verified the chamber was loaded and the safety was engaged. "Sit," Brill commanded. Julian collapsed against the smooth, sun-baked surface of a massive boulder, drawing his knees to his chest. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and increasingly erratic. His face was flushed a dangerous, unnatural shade of red, a clear indicator that his body was rapidly losing its ability to regulate its core temperature. Retrieving the plastic water bottle, Brill unscrewed the cap and handed it to the accountant. "Small sips," Brill instructed, his voice flat and clinical. "Swish the water in your mouth before swallowing. It stimulates the salivary glands and tricks the brain into registering hydration faster." Julian snatched the bottle with trembling hands, raising it to his cracked lips. He took a desperate, greedy swallow, instantly choking and coughing as the warm liquid hit his parched throat. "Small sips," Brill repeated, his tone devoid of empathy. "They're going to find us," Julian sobbed, clutching the bottle tightly against his chest, tears cutting fresh tracks through the thick layer of dust coating his cheeks. The drone. Silas Croft. They know we didn't die in the mine. They're going to sweep these canyons. Yes, Brill confirmed, scanning the high rims of the arroyo. They are. Retrieving his specialized mapping GPS from his tactical rig, Brill activated the device. The screen illuminated with a faint green glow, displaying a highly detailed topographical map of the surrounding Badlands. He zoomed in on their current coordinates. The twisting network of slot canyons and dry washes extended for 12 miles to the east, eventually spilling out onto a vast barren alkali flat. It was a desolate, hostile expanse of baked earth, devoid of any water sources or natural concealment. Croft will divide his element, Brill analyzed, tracing a finger across the digital map. He will send a tracking team down into this arroyo to follow our physical sign. He will deploy a secondary, motorized element to the perimeter of these canyons to establish a blocking position on the alkali flats. So we're trapped, Julian whispered, staring at the high red canyon walls closing in around them. We are channelized, Brill corrected, stowing the GPS and picking up his duffel bag. Channelization limits egress, but it also dictates the enemy's approach vector. A trap requires an anvil and a hammer. We are going to break the hammer. Turning away from the boulder, Brill resumed the punishing march deeper into the canyon. For the next 2 hours, the environment exacted a brutal toll. The soft sand of the wash gave way to sections of jagged, exposed bedrock that tore at Julian's improvised bandages. The heat intensified, a physical crushing weight that pressed down upon them, radiating off the canyon walls in shimmering waves of distortion. Julian's cognitive functions began to visibly degrade. He stumbled frequently, his coordination failing as severe dehydration thickened his blood and starved his brain of oxygen. He muttered incoherently, carrying on disjointed, fragmented conversations with phantoms from his corporate past. He argued about quarterly projections and offshore accounts, his words slurring and blurring together. Brill did not slow down. He did not offer comfort. He maintained a relentless, punishing pace, forcing the accountant to keep moving through the sheer, terrifying force of his own predatory presence. Rounding a sharp bend in the arroyo, the canyon narrowed dramatically. The towering red walls pinched inward, reducing the wide wash to a claustrophobic slot canyon barely 6 feet wide. The sunlight barely penetrated the deep crevice, plunging the narrow passage into deep, cool shadows. Brill stopped, raising a hand. He dropped to one knee, examining the ground. The sandy floor of the slot canyon was undisturbed, perfectly smooth and pristine. Moving forward cautiously, Brill entered the narrow passage. He walked for 20 yards, the high stone walls brushing against his shoulders. The slot canyon twisted sharply to the right, opening into a small, circular depression carved by centuries of swirling floodwaters. In the center of the depression, a massive dead ironwood tree lay wedged between the rock walls, washed down from the higher elevations decades ago and bleached bone-white by the sun. It was a natural choke point, a perfect, defensible bottleneck. We stop here, Brill stated, setting his duffel bag down behind the massive dead trunk of the ironwood tree. Julian stumbled into the depression, collapsing instantly onto the cool, shaded sand beneath the overhanging rock walls. He lay on his back, his chest heaving, his eyes closed. I can't go any further, he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. Just let me die here. It's cool. Ignoring the accountant, Brill went to work. He retrieved the captured SIG MCX Virtus rifle he had taken from the dead point man in the mine. Checking the action, he verified the chamber was loaded, and the heavy suppressed barrel was clear of obstruction. He laid the weapon carefully across the thick trunk of the ironwood tree, establishing a stable, fortified firing position covering the narrow entrance to the depression. Reaching into his tactical rig, he extracted a small, cylindrical object, an M67 fragmentation grenade. He moved back down the narrow slot canyon, stopping 10 yards from the entrance to the depression. He wedged the grenade tightly into a deep crevice in the canyon wall, about knee-high. Using a length of high-tensile monofilament fishing line, he rigged a simple, brutal tripwire across the narrow passage, securing the line to the grenade's pull ring. It was a devastating, lethal trap designed to shred anything moving through the confined space. Returning to the depression, Brill knelt behind the ironwood tree, picking up the suppressed rifle. He settled his breathing, lowering his heart rate, merging his awareness with the deep, cool shadows of the canyon. "They are coming," Brill said softly, his dark eyes locked on the narrow entrance to the slot canyon. Julian did not answer. He lay perfectly still on the sand, hovering on the dangerous, razor-thin edge of complete systemic failure. 10 minutes later, the first sound drifted down the canyon. It was faint, distorted by the twisting rock walls, but unmistakable. The sharp, metallic clatter of loose stones shifting beneath heavy combat boots. Silas Croft's tracking team had found the arroyo. Through the narrow opening of the slot canyon, Brill saw a flicker of movement. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the wash, moving with slow, disciplined caution. A point man stepped into view, his suppressed rifle raised, scanning the narrow passage ahead. Brill tightened his grip on the SIG MCX, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He did not fire. He waited for the geometry of the kill zone to perfectly align. The point man advanced, entering the claustrophobic slot canyon, his boots silent on the soft sand. He was 10 feet away from the invisible, monofilament tripwire. Behind him, 2 more operators stepped into the narrow passage, moving in a tight, disciplined file. Brill exhaled slowly, settling the crosshairs of the rifle's optic on the center mass of the trailing operator. Click. The faint, metallic sound of the grenade spoon flying off as the point man hit the tripwire was instantly swallowed by the deafening concussive roar of the explosion. The blast tore through the confined space of the slot canyon, a devastating shockwave of heat, pressure, and jagged steel shrapnel. The point man and the second operator were instantly shredded, their bodies ripped apart by the lethal fragmentation. Before the smoke and dust could even settle, Brill opened fire. He did not target the dead men. He aimed through the swirling debris, engaging the third operator who had been thrown backward by the blast. Firing a rapid, 3-round burst from the suppressed rifle, Brill dropped the man before he could even raise his weapon. The sharp, coughing fut-fut-fut of the suppressed weapon echoed strangely in the narrow canyon. Silence descended upon the depression, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of falling sand and the ragged, choking groans of the dying operator. Brill did not move from his fortified position. He kept his rifle trained on the smoke-filled passage, his eyes scanning for movement. "Are they dead?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling, terrified by the sudden, brutal violence. "3 down," Brill confirmed, his voice a flat, clinical drone. "Croft will not send more men into the bottleneck. He will fall back. He will call for air support." Sliding the rifle back across the ironwood trunk, Brill turned to the accountant. "Get up." Julian groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows. "Why? We beat them. We can stay here." "This position is compromised," Brill stated, grabbing his duffel bag. "Croft knows our exact location. He will use the drone to drop high-explosive ordnance directly into this depression. We have 3 minutes." Dragging Julian to his feet, Brill led the way to the back of the circular depression. The canyon wall here was not smooth, water-polished stone, but a jagged ascending staircase of broken shale and fractured limestone leading up toward the high rim of the arroyo. "We climb," Brill commanded. It was a desperate, agonizing ascent. Driven by raw terror, Julian scrambled up the loose rock, his bleeding hands finding purchase on the sharp edges, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged gasps. Brill climbed directly behind him, hauling the accountant upward when his strength failed. They crested the rim of the canyon, just as the high-pitched mechanical whine of the surveillance drone echoed down the arroyo. Rolling over the lip of the canyon wall, They scrambled onto the flat, baked surface of a vast limestone plateau. There was no cover, no concealment, only miles of blinding white rock, stretching out beneath the brutal afternoon sun. "Move," Brill ordered, grabbing Julian by the shoulder and dragging him forward away from the edge of the canyon. 2 seconds later, a deafening explosion ripped through the depression below them. The ground shook violently as the drone dropped a precision-guided munition directly onto their abandoned position, vaporizing the ironwood tree and showering the plateau with pulverized red rock. They staggered across the plateau, 2 exposed insignificant specks on a lunar landscape. Behind them, a thick plume of black smoke rose lazily from the canyon, a dark marker against the brilliant, unforgiving blue sky. Silas Croft knew exactly where they were. The hunt was far from over. Chapter 9. The limestone plateau was a shimmering, white-hot kiln that baked the very marrow from their bones. There was no shadow. There was no relief. The mid-afternoon sun hung directly overhead, a fixed, merciless eye that bleached the world of color and depth. Julian Reed stumbled behind Brill, his movements jerky and disjointed, like a marionette with tangled strings. His lips were swollen and cracked, split by the desert sun into raw, weeping fissures. Every breath was a ragged inhalation of dust and heat. Brill did not look back. He moved with a steady, metronomic cadence, his boots making only the faintest whisper on the hard-packed, fractured stone. He moved not like a man, but like a heat-seeking predator. His focus narrowed to the horizon line, his awareness expanded to the vibration of the air. He was listening for the whine. The surveillance drone was still out there, orbiting in a high, lazy circle, waiting for a thermal spike. They were 2 insignificant, sweating heat signatures in a world that had none. They aren't following us," Julian wheezed, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on wood. He clawed at the air, his fingers trembling, his eyes clouded with the early stages of heat delirium. "We lost them. Brill. We lost them." Brill stopped. He did not turn. He simply held up a hand, a sharp, arresting gesture. "They are not tracking the man," Brill said, his voice flat, devoid of the compassion Julian craved. "They are tracking the geometry." He gestured to the vast, open expanse. The plateau was not truly a flat plain. It was a series of shallow, natural drainage basins, a lunar landscape of ridges and depressions that funneled movement toward the east. It was a natural funnel, a topographical meat grinder designed by flash floods and wind, and Silas Croft had already anticipated the path of least resistance. "He has not sent his men to find us," Brill analyzed, tracing a finger across the horizon. "He has sent his men to wait for us. We are moving toward a blocking position." "Then we turn back," Julian gasped, collapsing onto the baking rock. The heat radiating off the surface was searing. "We go the other way." "There is no other way," Brill corrected, his gaze fixed on the shimmering waves of distortion that hid the distant ridgeline. "To the south is the alkali flat. No cover. To the west is the drone. We are channelized." He reached into his tactical rig, extracting the last spare magazine for the Mk-23. He checked the action, the metallic clack-clack of the slide sounding deafening in the silence. "We are going to make him think we have surrendered to the terrain," Brill said. He dropped to his stomach, pressing his body flush against a thin, jagged ridge of limestone. It offered the height of a fingernail, but in the desert it was a mountain. He pulled Julian down beside him, forcing the accountant's head into the dirt. "Stay low," Brill ordered, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Do not move. Do not think. Just breathe." They lay there for an hour, pinned to the earth, the heat a physical, crushing weight that pressed the air from their lungs. The drone's high-pitched mechanical whine grew louder, then softer as it orbited the plateau. Then the ground beneath them began to vibrate. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that traveled through the bedrock. It was the sound of a motorized column, armored vehicles moving with disciplined, tactical speed. Brill raised his head just enough to crest the ridge. 2 miles to the east, moving along the primary drainage basin, were 3 black SUVs, driving in a staggered column formation. They weren't patrolling, they were deploying. They were heading for the narrowest point of the canyon exit, the natural choke point that would act as the anvil to the hammer of the desert heat. Silas Croft had calculated their pace perfectly. "They are moving to set the trap," Brill said, his eyes hard and cold. "They will arrive at the bottleneck in 10 minutes. "Good," Julian whispered, his voice delirious, his eyes rolling back. We have time." "No," Brill said, standing up. The sudden movement was jarring, suicidal. "We have an opening." He pulled the captured SIG MCX Virtus from his sling. He checked the suppressor, then the optic. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the vast, desolate plateau. "They expect us to be tired," Brill said, his voice a flat, clinical drone. "They expect us to be broken. They expect us to walk into their anvil." He began to move, not toward the canyon, but toward the SUVs. "What are you doing?" Julian shrieked, the sound cracking in the windless heat. "You're going to walk into them." "I am going to change the geometry," Brill said. He moved with a sudden, violent energy, breaking into a run across the open limestone. He was an exposed, frantic target in the middle of a blinding white field. The drone's whine suddenly spiked, a shrill mechanical alarm. It had acquired them. "Keep moving," Brill commanded, not slowing. "The drone is turning. It will drop its payload on the highest thermal signature." They scrambled across the plateau, 2 exposed insignificant specks. Behind them, the high-pitched mechanical drone shifted its pitch, diving toward their original position. Brill didn't stop. He pushed Julian forward, dragging him toward the center of the drainage basin, directly into the path of the approaching SUVs. "They think we are retreating to the canyon," Brill said. "They are preparing to block it. When the drone strikes, it will target our last known position." He pushed Julian into a shallow depression, a natural wind-scoured basin. Down. 2 seconds later, the world ended. The precision-guided munition slammed into the limestone where they had been lying seconds before. The explosion was a blinding white-hot blossom of pulverized rock and flame. The shockwave was a sledgehammer that threw them face-first into the dirt, the roar of the blast echoing in their teeth. They lay there, covered in a fine white shroud of pulverized dust, as the smoke drifted lazily upward. "They think we are vaporized," Brill said, his voice a flat, hollow echo. He stood up, shaking the dust from his tactical rig. The SUVs had slammed on their brakes. The column stopped, the operators spilling out to investigate the plume of smoke rising from their kill. Silas Croft was among them. Brill leveled the suppressed rifle, the crosshairs settling on the center mass of the man who had turned the Badlands into a meat grinder. "The anvil is empty," Brill said, and squeezed the trigger. "I have ensured this chapter maintains the established tone and pacing. The tactical shift here, using the enemy's own tracking and ordnance against them, is a quintessential Brill Wingfield move. As a reminder, I have referenced the background files you provided throughout the development of the Sonora Sanction. How would you like Chapter 10 to proceed? Should the chase turn into a direct tactical confrontation, or does Brill have a larger, more devious plan for Croft? Chapter 10. The suppressed cough of the SIG MCX barely disturbed the heavy desert air. 300 yards away, the man in the center of the column jerked backward, his chest cavity absorbing the supersonic impact of the round. He dropped into the white dust. Brill chambered another round, the crosshairs already sweeping toward the next target. He expected panic. He expected the operators to scramble for the cover of the SUVs, granting him a precious 10-second window to grab Julian and disappear into the labyrinth of drainage basins behind them. Silas Croft did not panic. Before the dead man's knees had fully buckled, Croft barked an order and dove behind the front tire of the lead vehicle. The surviving operators didn't hesitate. They didn't look for the shooter. They simply raised their weapons and saturated the ridgeline with overwhelming, sustained automatic fire. The limestone lip 2 inches from Brill's face exploded. A jagged shard of rock tore across his cheekbone, drawing a hot line of blood. The air instantly filled with the deafening crack and whine of incoming rounds, a relentless barrage that chewed the top of the ridge into a cloud of white, blinding dust. Croft hadn't brought his men to wait in an anvil. He had brought them to trigger an ambush, and he had already mapped the likely sniper hides. Brill's tactical calculus had been entirely wrong. Brill abandoned his firing position, rolling backward down the slope of the depression. He grabbed the back of Julian's ruined shirt and hauled the accountant to his feet. "Run," Brill said. Julian stared at him, his cracked lips trembling, his eyes wide and uncomprehending in a face plastered with sweat and rock dust. The sustained roar of the gunfire echoing across the plateau had paralyzed him. Brill didn't repeat himself. He shoved Julian hard in the chest, forcing him into a stumbling sprint down the shallow, rocky decline. They scrambled through the fractured landscape, the heat radiating off the canyon floor, baking them from below while the afternoon sun hammered them from above. Bullets snapped through the air overhead, tearing through the sparse scrub oak and shattering the brittle limestone. Croft was using a bounding overwatch, half his men laying down suppressive fire while the other half advanced. They were fast, aggressive, and perfectly coordinated. "My feet," Julian gasped, stumbling over a jagged outcropping. The makeshift duct tape bandages had worn completely through. Bloody footprints marked his path on the pale stone. I can't keep up." Brill grabbed him by the harness of his tactical rig and dragged him forward, plunging into a narrow, winding fissure that offered temporary cover from the high ground. He checked his 6. The dust cloud from the SUVs was settling. The gunfire had paused. That was worse than the noise. It meant Croft's men were moving, fanning out, establishing a perimeter to box them into the drainage basin. Brill paused at a fork in the fissure, listening past the harsh rasp of Julian's breathing. He heard the high-pitched, angry whine of 2-stroke engines. Dirt bikes. Croft had deployed a mobile flanking element, keeping them out of sight until the trap was sprung. The sound was coming from the north, moving fast along the rim of the basin, cutting off their intended route toward the deep canyons. Brill cursed softly. He shoved Julian against the wall of the fissure. "They're on bikes," Brill said. "They are going to cut us off before we reach the canyon mouth." "Then what do we do?" Julian wheezed, sliding down the rock wall until he hit the dirt. His eyes were rolling, his cognitive functions failing as the dehydration thickened his blood. "Just let them kill us. I'm done. Brill, I'm done." "Stay down," Brill said, ignoring the panic. He unslung the captured SIG MCX, checking the optic. He climbed a short pile of fallen boulders, bringing his eyes level with the edge of the fissure. 2 men on lightweight, desert camouflage dirt bikes were cresting the ridge 200 yards away. They rode standing on the pegs, moving with reckless speed over the broken terrain, their assault rifles slung across their chests. They were sweeping the basin, looking down into the crevices. Brill settled the stock of the rifle against his shoulder. He tracked the lead rider leading the target, calculating the speed and the uneven bounce of the terrain. He squeezed the trigger. The lead rider's head snapped back as the round punched through his helmet. The bike lurched violently to the right, hitting a limestone shelf and launching the dead man over the handlebars in a chaotic tangle of limbs and spinning metal. The second rider reacted instantly. He dropped his bike into a controlled slide, using the machine as cover as he hit the dirt. He brought his rifle up and began laying down suppressive fire toward Brill's position. The rounds shattered the rocks around Brill, forcing him to drop back down into the fissure. "He's pinned us," Brill said, checking the magazine. 3 rounds left. "I can't breathe," Julian sobbed, clawing at his own throat. He was hyperventilating, raw terror accelerating his physical collapse. He scrambled blindly to his feet, disoriented by the echoing gunfire. "Get down." Brill reached for him. Julian panicked. He bolted, not deeper into the fissure, but scrambling blindly up the exposed side of the rock wall, trying to escape the claustrophobic noise of the canyon. He crested the rim, fully exposing himself to the remaining dirt bike rider. The mercenary didn't hesitate. A burst of automatic fire ripped through the air. Julian screamed, spinning wildly as a round clipped his shoulder. He tumbled backward, falling 10 feet down the jagged rock face and crashing into the dust at Brill's feet in a limp, groaning heap. Brill abandoned the rifle. It was useless for the angle he needed. He drew the heavy Mk-23 pistol, pushing off the canyon wall and sprinting toward the spot where Julian had fallen. He scrambled up the rocks, exposing his head and shoulders just as the mercenary moved out from behind the downed dirt bike to finish the kill. Brill fired twice. The heavy .45 caliber rounds took the man in the chest, dropping him instantly onto the baked earth. Silence rushed back into the basin, broken only by the hiss of the wind and Julian's ragged weeping. Brill slid back down into the fissure and knelt beside the accountant. The bullet had taken a chunk of flesh out of Julian's left deltoid. It was a messy, bleeding graze, but it hadn't hit the bone or the artery. "Hold still," Brill said, ripping a field dressing from his kit with his teeth. He packed the wound with quick clotting gauze, applying brutal, necessary pressure. Julian shrieked, thrashing against him. "It burns." "God, it burns." "Keep your voice down," Brill ordered, tying the dressing off with a strip of canvas. Croft heard the shots. His main element is less than a mile out. He pulled Julian to his feet, throwing the man's good arm over his shoulder to bear the weight. He retrieved the SIG MCX from the dirt, checking the action. The breech was jammed with sand and grit from the scramble. He didn't have time to clear it. He dropped it, relying entirely on the Mk-23 and his 2 spare magazines. They staggered down the winding length of the fissure. The air was stagnant, baking them in a convection oven of pale stone. Brill's muscles burned with the effort of carrying the accountant's dead weight. The wound on his cheek stung fiercely, a constant reminder of how narrowly he had miscalculated. The fissure finally widened, spilling them out of the limestone labyrinth. Brill stopped, staring at the horizon. There was no cover. The jagged badlands abruptly gave way to the Sonora alkali flat. It was a vast, blindingly white expanse of cracked salt and baked mud that stretched for 10 miles in every direction. The heat radiating off the surface created shimmering mirages that turned the distant mountains into liquid distortions. It was a dead zone. Nothing lived on the salt flat. There were no shadows, no crevices, no rocks. "We can't," Julian wheezed, staring out at the blinding expanse. He swayed on his feet, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "We'll roast out there. We'll be completely exposed." Behind them, the sharp crunch of combat boots on loose gravel echoed down the fissure. Croft's men were moving fast, closing the net. Brill looked back toward the canyon, then out at the deadly shimmering white plain. He adjusted his grip on the Mk-23 and tightened his hold on Julian's waist. "Walk," Brill said, stepping out onto the blinding salt. Chapter 11. The salt crust shattered beneath their boots with a rhythmic, brittle snapping that sounded far too loud. There was no horizon. The punishing mid-afternoon sun pounded the Sonora alkali flat, baking the moisture from the earth and replacing it with a blinding omnidirectional glare. Heat distortion rose in shimmering liquid waves, turning the vast expanse into a mirrored sea that offered no depth perception and zero concealment. Brill kept his grip tight on Julian's harness, practically carrying the accountant. Julian's chin rested on his chest, his eyes squeezed shut against the agonizing brightness. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. A geyser of pulverized salt erupted 10 feet to Brill's left. A split second later, the sharp, supersonic crack of a high-velocity rifle rolled across the flat. Brill didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, dragging Julian down hard against the baked earth. He brought the heavy Mk-23 pistol up, his eyes squinting against the glare, scanning the jagged edge of the Badlands behind them. The canyon mouth was 400 yards away. Through the shimmering heat waves, he saw the faint dark silhouettes of Croft's men spilling out onto the edge of the playa. They were spreading out, taking prone firing positions. Another round snapped through the air, inches above Brill's head. He was completely outgunned. The effective range of the .45 caliber pistol was 50 yards. Against scoped assault rifles over open ground, tactical calculus evaporated. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. "They're going to shoot us," Julian whimpered, his face pressed into the blinding white dust. "We can't hide." Brill ignored him, his eyes locked on the tree line. The sporadic rifle fire ceased. Croft was too smart to waste ammunition on pot shots through severe heat distortion. He was a hunter who preferred a guaranteed kill. The deep guttural roar of a high-output V8 engine shattered the desert silence. One of the black SUVs surged out from the mouth of the fissure. It hit the flat expanse of the playa, accelerating hard, its massive tires churning up a thick, trailing wake of white dust. It was moving at 60 miles an hour, driving a direct, lethal intercept vector straight toward them. A gunner leaned out of the passenger side window, an assault rifle braced against the roof, waiting for the range to close. "Get up," Brill commanded, hauling Julian to his feet. "Where?" Julian shrieked, his legs buckling. "There's nowhere to go." Brill scanned the featureless plain. The alkali flat appeared solid, a continuous sheet of baked white salt. But Brill knew the geology of dry lakes. The crust was a deceptive veneer, masking a subterranean layer of deep, unstable mud. He searched the shimmering mirages, looking for a tell, a slight discoloration, a shift in the heat waves that indicated a thinner crust. He spotted a patch 70 yards to their right. The salt there wasn't blinding white. It held a faint, sickly grayish hue, sweating moisture into the baking air. A soft pan. A terrain trap. "Run toward the gray patch," Brill ordered, shoving Julian forward. They staggered across the crust, a frantic, agonizing sprint. Behind them, the roar of the SUV grew deafening. The gunner opened fire. A burst of 5.56 mm rounds chewed a violent line through the salt right behind Brill's heels. Sharp shards of crystallized earth stung his calves. "Keep moving," Brill yelled. Julian tripped over his own ruined feet, crashing hard onto his shoulder. He scrambled frantically in the dust, hyperventilating, raw terror finally breaking his mind. He curled into a fetal ball, refusing to get up. The SUV was 150 yards out and closing fast. The gunner adjusted his aim, preparing to cut them to pieces. Brill stopped running. He turned to face the charging, 2-ton mass of steel and glass. He planted his boots wide on the salt crust, raising the Mk-23 in a two-handed grip. He was perfectly exposed, drawing the vehicle's vector directly over the gray patch of unstable earth. The gunner fired again. A round punched through the heavy canvas webbing of Brill's tactical vest, scoring a deep, burning groove along his left ribcage. The kinetic impact spun him slightly, driving the breath from his lungs in a sharp grunt. Pain flared, hot and immediate, followed by the slick warmth of fresh blood running down his flank. He forced himself to square back to the target. He didn't aim at the gunner or the armored windshield. He aimed low, leading the hurtling vehicle by a fraction of an inch. He waited until the SUV hit the edge of the gray pan. 80 yards. Brill fired 3 rapid shots. The heavy, 230-grain slugs crossed the distance in a heartbeat. 2 struck the reinforced steel of the front bumper. The third found the front driver's side tire. The heavy rubber shredded instantly. The rim dropped, biting violently through the thin gray crust and plunging deep into the soft subterranean mud. At 60 miles an hour, the sudden catastrophic loss of momentum on one corner was devastating. The rear end of the SUV lifted into the air. The heavy vehicle flipped forward, launching into a horrific tumbling barrel roll. Glass shattered into a glittering cloud. Metal shrieked and crumpled as the SUV smashed into the salt flat, rolling 3 times before coming to a rest on its crushed roof, 100 feet from where Brill stood. A thick cloud of white dust and black engine smoke settled over the wreckage. Brill didn't lower the pistol. He kept his sights trained on the crushed cab, his breathing ragged, his ribs burning fiercely with every inhalation. Nothing moved inside the twisted metal. He turned away from the wreck, limping slightly, as he walked over to where Julian lay trembling in the dust. He grabbed the harness and hauled the accountant upright. "Walk," Brill said, wiping a mixture of sweat and blood from his jawline. Behind them, the distant angry whine of dirt bike engines echoed from the canyon mouth. Croft had lost his hammer, but the hunt was far from over. They stepped deeper into the blinding white void. Chapter 12. Every step across the Sonora alkali flat felt like walking over a bed of crushed fluorescent bulbs. The glare bouncing off the crystallized white crust was absolute, searing the retinas and destroying all sense of depth perception. Brill kept his right arm locked around Julian's chest. He dragged the accountant forward, their boots leaving twin trails of disturbed gray-white powder. Salt dust coated the open groove along Brill's left ribcage. The chemical sting turned a dull throbbing ache into a sharp, continuous electrical shock with every breath. He tasted copper and dehydration. "I'm blind," Julian gasped, his eyes squeezed shut, his head lolling against Brill's shoulder. "I can't see the ground." "Keep your eyes closed," Brill said. "Keep moving your legs." The high-pitched, angry whine of 2-stroke engines echoed across the flat. The sound warped through the thermal distortion, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact distance, but the pitch was escalating. The dirt bikes had bypassed the wreckage of the SUV and were tracking their physical sign across the pristine salt. Brill scanned the featureless void ahead. The mirage turned the horizon into a shimmering, liquid mirror. Nothing existed but the blinding white earth and the brutal blue sky. A man caught in the open against motorized pursuit had a life expectancy measured in seconds. A jagged, dark line broke the shimmering distortion half a mile ahead. It looked like a row of broken, dirty teeth thrusting upward through the white crust. A pressure ridge. Tectonic forces beneath the dry lake bed had buckled the salt crust, forcing massive slabs of crystallized earth into the air. It was a chaotic pile of jagged, razor-sharp slabs, rising perhaps 10 feet high and stretching for 100 yards. "We have cover," Brill said, adjusting his grip on Julian and forcing them into a stumbling jog. The engine noise behind them spiked. Brill glanced over his shoulder. 2 dark specks materialized out of the heat haze, moving fast, kicking up twin rooster tails of white dust. They were closing the gap at 40 miles an hour. "Faster," Brill pushed the accountant. Julian's ruined feet gave out entirely. He collapsed, dragging Brill down with him. The sudden jolt ripped through Brill's injured ribs, driving the breath from his lungs in a sharp, involuntary grunt. He hit the salt crust hard, scraping his forearms raw. He didn't waste oxygen, yelling at the civilian. Brill scrambled to his feet, grabbed the heavy webbing of Julian's tactical harness, and hauled him upright. He practically carried the man the last 50 yards, his boots slipping on the brittle surface. They crashed into the shadow of the pressure ridge, just as the dirt bikes closed to within 300 yards. Brill threw Julian into a narrow V-shaped crevice between 2 massive tilted slabs of gray salt. The crystalline edges were sharp as broken glass, immediately slicing through Julian's ruined dress shirt and drawing fresh blood. Julian whimpered, curling into a tight, trembling ball against the rock. Brill didn't join him in the crevice. He climbed the backside of the nearest slab, his boots finding precarious purchase on the jagged salt. He flattened his stomach against the hot, rough surface, ignoring the sting of the salt in his fresh wounds. He pushed the heavy MK-23 pistol over the top edge. The 2 mercenaries didn't charge blindly. They had seen the wreckage of the SUV. They respected the threat. 100 yards out, the bikes separated. They dropped their speed, sweeping wide in a coordinated pincer movement, intending to flank the pressure ridge from opposite ends. Brill tracked the rider, swinging to the left. The target was moving laterally at 20 miles an hour, bobbing over the uneven crust. He steadied his breathing, fighting the sharp, stabbing pain in his ribs. He aligned the heavy iron sights, leading the rider's helmet by a fraction of an inch. He applied pressure to the trigger. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a sudden, blinding drop in blood pressure brought on by the heat and the blood loss. His vision blurred for a microsecond. The pistol bucked. The heavy .45 caliber slug struck the salt crust 2 feet behind the dirt bike's rear tire, throwing up a harmless puff of white dust. He had missed. The rider reacted instantly. He dropped the bike into a slide, laying the machine down and using it as a steel barricade. He brought his assault rifle up and unleashed a sustained, disciplined burst of automatic fire. The top of the salt slab, inches from Brill's face, disintegrated. Shards of pulverized crystal exploded into his cheek and forehead. He dropped back down behind the slab, sliding into the narrow trench beside Julian, just as a second stream of bullets hammered the opposite side of the ridge. The right flank rider had opened fire. They were pinned in a crossfire. "They have us," Julian sobbed, pressing his hands over his ears. "They have us." Brill checked the magazine of the Mk-23. 5 rounds left. He couldn't win a sustained firefight against 2 rifles. His hands were shaking slightly. The heat exhaustion was severely degrading his fine motor skills. He wiped a mixture of sweat and blood from his eyes. The gunfire stopped. "Moving," a voice echoed across the salt flat. They were communicating. Bounding overwatch. One rider keeping them pinned, while the other advanced to secure an angle into the crevice. Brill holstered the pistol. He drew the captured combat knife from his belt. He crawled to the far end of the V-shaped crevice, putting 10 feet of jagged salt between himself and Julian. He pressed his back against a sheer, vertical slab, making himself as small as possible. The gap here was barely 2 feet wide. He listened past the hammering of his own heart. He heard the crunch of heavy combat boots on the salt crust, moving slowly around the edge of the pressure ridge. The right flank rider was moving in to clear the blind spot. The boot steps stopped right at the entrance to the crevice. A shadow fell across the white dust. The barrel of an assault rifle breached the opening, followed instantly by the head and shoulders of a mercenary in desert camouflage. The mercenary didn't see Brill, pressed flat against the rock just inside the entrance. He saw Julian, 30 feet down the trench, curled into a pathetic bleeding ball. The mercenary smiled, raising the rifle to finish the civilian. Brill stepped out of the shadow. He drove his left forearm hard into the side of the rifle, batting the weapon away just as it fired. The burst deafened him, chewing into the salt wall above Julian's head. Simultaneously, Brill drove the combat knife forward in a brutal upward thrust, aiming for the soft gap beneath the mercenary's body armor. The mercenary was fast. He twisted, dropping his shoulder to deflect the strike. The knife skittered off the heavy ceramic strike plate of his tactical vest, the blade biting deeply into his bicep instead of his chest. The man grunted, dropping the rifle, and swinging a massive panicked backhand that caught Brill squarely on his injured ribs. White-hot agony exploded through Brill's chest. His legs buckled. He fell back against the jagged salt wall, the knife slipping from his grasp. The mercenary drew a heavy pistol from his drop-leg holster, racking the slide and bringing the muzzle down to point directly at Brill's face. Brill didn't reach for his own weapon. He kicked outward with his heavy combat boot, aiming for the man's kneecap. The blow connected with a sickening crack. The mercenary screamed, his leg collapsing backward. The pistol fired wildly into the dirt, as the man fell heavily into the narrow crevice. Brill threw his entire body weight forward, pinning the thrashing man against the opposite wall. He ignored the burning pain in his ribs, driving his elbow in a vicious short arc directly into the mercenary's throat. The man's eyes bulged. He dropped the pistol, clawing desperately at his crushed windpipe. He slid down the salt wall, choking, his legs kicking uselessly in the white dust. Brill fell back against the rock, his chest heaving, his vision swimming in a sea of gray static. He picked up the dropped assault rifle, his hands slick with the other man's blood. Silence descended on the pressure ridge. The second rider didn't advance. He had heard the struggle, the sudden end to the gunfire. The sharp roar of a dirt bike engine violently revving shattered the quiet. The surviving mercenary had realized the trap. He wasn't coming in. Brill dragged himself to the edge of the crevice and looked out. The second dirt bike was tearing away across the alkali flat, putting a quarter-mile between himself and the jagged rocks. The rider stopped, turned the bike sideways and pulled a radio from his vest. He was calling Silas Croft. He was calling the main element. Brill looked down at the dead man in the trench, then back out at the vast, blinding expanse of the dead lake. They had a weapon now, but they were trapped on an island of salt, and the hammer was finally coming down. Chapter 13. Brill stripped the dead mercenary of his tactical rig. He didn't waste movement. He pulled 2 M18 smoke grenades, a spare magazine for the captured assault rifle, and a heavy ceramic strike plate from the man's vest. He handed the strike plate to Julian. "Hold this over your chest," Brill said. Julian sat slumped in the narrow V of the crevice, his eyes glazed, his chin resting on his chest. He didn't reach for the plate. Blood from his grazed shoulder had soaked the left side of his makeshift bandages, turning the white cloth a rusty brown. Brill grabbed Julian's good hand and forced the heavy ceramic plate into it, pressing it against the accountant's sternum. Julian groaned, his fingers curling weakly around the edges. The low, throbbing rumble of heavy engines bled through the heat haze. Brill moved to the edge of the jagged salt slab and looked out. 2 black SUVs and the surviving dirt bike emerged from the shimmering mirage on the eastern edge of the alkali flat. They stopped exactly 400 yards away. Silas Croft wasn't going to rush the pressure ridge. He deployed his men in a wide, crescent formation, turning the vehicles sideways to create a wall of steel cover. 4 operators took up prone firing positions on the salt crust, resting the barrels of their scoped rifles on sandbags. They had the ridge completely bracketed. 400 yards was point-blank range for magnified optics, but it was virtually impossible for Brill to return effective fire using standard iron sights. "We are pinned," Julian said. His voice was a dry, hollow scrape. Brill looked down the length of the pressure ridge. 100 yards out on the blinding white crust, the dead mercenary's dirt bike lay on its side. It was a 450cc enduro machine, the engine off, the keys still in the ignition. It was the only way off the flat. Brill knelt beside the dead mercenary. He grabbed the man under the armpits and hauled him upright. The sudden exertion sent a sharp, agonizing tear through Brill's injured ribs. He bit down on a curse, tasting copper, and forced the dead weight forward. He propped the corpse against the edge of the salt slab, positioning the helmet and the shoulders just above the rim. He took the dead man's rifle and wedged it under his chin, making it look like a shooter preparing to fire over the barricade. "When the shooting starts," Brill said, looking at Julian, "do not move." Brill pulled the pins on both M18 smoke grenades. He tossed them over the top of the pressure ridge, aiming for the open ground between the rocks and the downed dirt bike. The canisters popped. Thick, billowing clouds of dense white smoke erupted onto the salt flat, expanding rapidly in the stagnant baking air. Croft's men reacted instantly to the visual trigger. They saw the movement. They saw the helmet cresting the ridge through the smoke. 4 scoped rifles opened fire simultaneously. The concentrated volley hammered the salt slab. The dead mercenary's helmet snapped backward as 2 high-velocity rounds punched through the Kevlar. The corpse tumbled backward, sliding down the rocks and crashing into the dust at Brill's feet. Croft's firing line was completely focused on the decoy, pouring sustained suppressive fire into the center of the crevice. Brill didn't wait for them to realize they were shooting a dead man. He broke from cover, scrambling over the far end of the pressure ridge and sprinting headlong into the expanding wall of white smoke. He ran in a low crouch. The salt crust cracked beneath his boots. His ribcage burned, a continuous hot wire of pain stretching across his chest with every ragged breath. He kept his eyes locked on the faint, dark shape of the downed dirt bike ahead of him. The smoke began to thin near the 50-yard mark. A sharp crack echoed across the flat. A round whipped past Brill's ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. One of the operators had shifted his scope. Brill hit the deck, sliding hard across the brittle salt crust. The jagged edges tore through his tactical pants, scraping the skin off his knees and shins. He brought the captured rifle up, pressing the stock hard into his bruised shoulder. He didn't try to aim at the distant, entrenched shooters. He aimed at the dirt bike, 20 yards away. He fired 3 single shots at the salt crust directly in front of the bike. The heavy 5.56 mm rounds impacted the brittle surface, throwing up massive, blinding plumes of white, pulverized crystal. Using his own miniature smokescreen, Brill scrambled forward on his hands and knees. He reached the bike and grabbed the handlebars. The machine weighed nearly 250 pounds. He threw his leg over the seat, planted his boots, and heaved. His ribs flared in absolute blinding agony. His vision dropped to a pinhole. The bike came upright. He hit the starter button. The engine turned over once, twice, and caught with a deafening 2-stroke roar. Gunfire chewed into the salt around the tires. A round pinged off the metal swing arm. Brill dumped the clutch. The rear tire spun wildly, kicking up a massive rooster tail of salt dust before finding traction. He dropped his head over the handlebars and launched the bike forward, tearing back toward the pressure ridge. He slammed on the brakes at the edge of the crevice, laying the bike down hard to keep it under the cover of the jagged rocks. He scrambled into the trench. Julian was curled in a fetal position, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut against the noise. "Get up," Brill said. Julian shook his head frantically. Brill grabbed the heavy webbing of Julian's harness and hauled him to his feet. He dragged the accountant toward the idling dirt bike. "Get on the back," Brill said. "Wrap your arms around my waist. Lock your hands together." Julian stared at the machine, then out at the blinding, bullet-riddled expanse of the salt flat. He climbed awkwardly onto the back seat, his ruined feet slipping on the pegs. He threw his arms around Brill, his grip weak and trembling. Brill kicked the bike into gear. He looked at the edge of the ridge. Croft's men had stopped firing. They were reloading, waiting for the smoke to clear, waiting to see what emerged. Brill twisted the throttle. The bike shot out from the cover of the pressure ridge, launching onto the open alkali flat. Brill didn't drive away from the mercenaries. He drove straight south, running parallel to their firing line, presenting a fast lateral target moving at 50 miles an hour. The gunfire resumed. Tracers zipped through the shimmering heat haze, tracking the bike's vector. "Hold on," Brill yelled over the roar of the engine. He threw his weight sideways, whipping the bike into a series of sharp, erratic swerves. A bullet punched through the plastic fairing near Brill's knee. Another shattered the left rearview mirror. They tore across the blinding white crust, putting distance between themselves and the anvil Croft had built. The jagged edge of the Badlands rose in the distance, a dark promise of cover and deep canyons. Chapter 14. The 450cc enduro bike was built for a single rider over dirt, not 2 men over a fractured crust of salt and mud. The suspension bottomed out violently with every jarring impact, sending a fresh spike of agony through Brill's fractured ribs. Julian's grip around Brill's waist felt like the desperate clamping of a drowning man. His face was buried between Brill's shoulder blades. The heat haze swallowed the pressure ridge behind them, replacing the jagged gray rock with a shimmering wall of liquid distortion. Brill didn't look back. The rear-view mirror was shattered. He kept his eyes locked on the dark, ragged edge of the Badlands rising in the east, a fortress of limestone and shadow that offered the only chance of breaking Croft's line of sight. "Are they behind us?" Julian asked. His voice barely carried over the deafening roar of the two-stroke engine. "Yes," Brill said. He didn't need a mirror to know Silas Croft was in pursuit. The XJSOC tracker wouldn't abandon the hunt just because the prey had found temporary mobility. The surviving SUV would be tearing across the alkali flat, a 2-ton anvil driven by men who understood exactly how to cut off a retreat. The edge of the playa approached rapidly. The blinding white crust gave way to a treacherous transitional zone of deep, loose sand and scattered boulders. Brill didn't slow down. He stood up on the pegs, taking the jarring impacts with his legs to protect his injured ribs, and wrestled the heavy machine through the deep sand. The rear tire fishtailed wildly, fighting for traction, before finally biting into the hard-packed dirt at the base of the foothills. They hit the mouth of a dry wash at 40 miles an hour. The canyon walls rose sharply on either side, casting deep, cool shadows that felt like a physical shock after hours in the searing glare of the salt flat. The wash twisted sharply to the right, funneling them into a narrow ascending corridor of red rock and scrub oak. Brill dropped a gear and twisted the throttle, pushing the bike up the steep incline. He checked the fuel gauge. The tank was less than a quarter full. They had maybe 20 miles of hard riding left before the engine sputtered and died. "We need to stop," Julian gasped. "I can't feel my hands." "We stop when we run out of gas," Brill said. The canyon narrowed, the smooth rock walls pressing in until there was barely enough room for the handlebars to clear. The trail grew steeper, littered with jagged rocks and fallen timber. Brill wrestled the bike over the obstacles, his arms burning, his ribs a constant hot wire of pain. They crested the ridge 20 minutes later, emerging onto a high, flat plateau covered in dense, spiny chala cactus and brittle brush. Brill killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, ringing in his ears. He let the bike drop onto its side in the dust. Julian didn't get off the bike. He fell off, collapsing onto the hard-packed earth, his chest heaving, his ruined feet bleeding through the makeshift duct tape bandages. Brill ignored him. He drew the heavy MK-23 pistol and moved to the edge of the plateau, looking down into the canyon they had just climbed. The dust trail of their ascent hung in the stagnant air, a clear, lingering marker pointing directly to their position. A mile below, at the mouth of the dry wash, the black SUV appeared. It stopped, the heavy tires churning up a cloud of dirt. 2 men got out, carrying assault rifles. They crouched beside the vehicle, examining the tracks in the sand. "They found the trail," Brill said softly. He walked back to the downed dirt bike. He opened the small compartment under the seat and pulled out a battered canvas tool roll. He unwrapped it, revealing a few rusted wrenches, a spark plug puller, and a roll of electrical tape. He took the spark plug puller and knelt beside the engine. He didn't try to fix the bike. He began to dismantle it. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, pushing himself up on his elbows. "They are tracking the machine," Brill said. He unscrewed the spark plug, then took his combat knife and slashed the fuel line, letting the remaining gas drain into the dry earth. He unhooked the heavy battery from its casing and hauled it out. He placed the battery in the center of the dust trail, 20 feet away from the bike. He took a spare magazine for the MK-23 from his tactical vest. He removed the heavy .45 caliber rounds, pouring the gunpowder from each casing into a small pile on top of the battery terminals. He stripped 2 lengths of wire from the bike's wiring harness. He attached one end of each wire to the battery terminals, burying the exposed copper in the small pile of gunpowder. He took the spark plug he had removed from the engine. He smashed the ceramic casing against a rock, exposing the inner electrode. He attached the other ends of the wires to the spark plug. He had built a crude, highly unstable detonator. "Get up," Brill said, looking at Julian. Julian stared at the battery and the pile of gunpowder. "You're going to blow up the bike." "I am going to build a wall," Brill said. He grabbed the heavy webbing of Julian's harness and hauled him to his feet. He shoved the accountant toward the dense thicket of chala cactus at the far edge of the plateau. "Get behind the rocks and stay down." Brill moved back to the edge of the ridge. The two mercenaries were back in the SUV. The vehicle was moving slowly up the dry wash, grinding over the rocks, following the fresh tracks of the dirt bike. They were 500 yards out. 400. Brill didn't wait for them to reach the plateau. He walked back to the crude detonator. He picked up a heavy rock and smashed it down hard on the exposed electrode of the spark plug. The spark arced. The gunpowder ignited instantly, a blinding flash that engulfed the battery terminals. The battery exploded. It wasn't a concussive blast. It was a chemical fire. The battery acid and the ignited fuel from the slashed line erupted into a localized inferno. The dry brush around the bike caught fire instantly, the flames racing through the brittle chala cactus and the dead scrub oak. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, a dark, impenetrable curtain that immediately blocked the narrow path leading onto the plateau. Brill grabbed the Mk-23 and sprinted for the cover of the rocks where Julian was hiding. Down in the canyon, the SUV slammed on its brakes. The mercenaries couldn't drive through the wall of fire and smoke. The trap had forced them to stop. The doors of the SUV flew open. Croft's men piled out, their rifles raised, peering through the smoke, trying to find targets. Brill didn't shoot. He waited. The smoke was drifting down into the canyon, choking the narrow wash. The mercenaries began to cough, backing away from the burning brush. "They're falling back," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "No," Brill said, his eyes fixed on the smoke. "They are flanking." He saw the movement on the ridge to their left. Two men, moving fast through the brush, trying to get above the smoke line to secure a firing angle onto the plateau. They were disciplined. They were lethal. Brill checked the magazine of the Mk-23. 6 rounds left. "Stay here," Brill said to Julian. He broke from cover, keeping low, moving silently through the dense brush, circling behind the advancing flankers. The two mercenaries reached a rocky outcropping 50 yards away. They went prone, bringing their rifles up, scanning the smoke-filled plateau for targets. Brill came up behind them. He didn't fire. The noise would give away his position to the men still down in the canyon. He drew his combat knife. He moved silently across the rocky ground. He grabbed the trailing mercenary, clamping a hand over his mouth and driving the knife upward into the base of his skull. The man went limp instantly. The second mercenary heard the soft thud. He spun around, bringing his rifle to bear. Brill didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking the rifle barrel aside with his left arm and driving the knife deep into the man's chest. The mercenary gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed onto the rocks. Brill pulled the knife free. He wiped the blade on the dead man's shirt and turned back toward the plateau. The fire was dying down, the smoke thinning. The men in the canyon would be moving up soon. He had bought them a few minutes, but the hunt was far from over. Chapter 15. Brill dropped his combat knife and grabbed the dead mercenary's rifle. It was a short-barreled Mk-18, slick with the owner's blood. He stripped 2 spare magazines from the corpse's vest, shoved them into his own empty pouches, and unhooked a plastic canteen. He didn't check the other body. He didn't have time. The wind shifted, dragging the thick black smoke down into the canyon and exposing the lip of the plateau. A heavy rhythmic thumping echoed from the dry wash. A light machine gun opened up. A continuous stream of suppressive fire chewed into the rocky outcropping where Brill stood. Pulverized stone exploded into the air, peppering his face and neck. Croft's men were moving up through the thinning smoke, laying down a wall of lead to cover their advance. Brill threw himself backward, sliding on his stomach across the dirt. He scrambled on his hands and knees through the brittle brush, keeping his head down as tracers snapped through the air inches above him, setting the dry scrub oak on fire. He reached the dense thicket of chala cactus. Julian lay curled on his side, his hands covering his head, shivering violently despite the baking heat. Brill hauled the accountant up by his tactical harness. The sudden weight pulled brutally at Brill's chest. A fresh wave of agony radiated from his injured ribs, stealing his breath. "Walk," Brill said. Julian's eyes were glassy, rolling unsteadily in their sockets. He took a shambling step and collapsed against Brill's shoulder. Brill unscrewed the cap of the captured canteen. He poured a handful of lukewarm water directly over Julian's face. The accountant gasped, his eyes snapping into focus for a fraction of a second. Brill pressed the plastic rim to Julian's cracked lips. "Swallow." Julian choked down a mouthful of water before Brill pulled the canteen away. He hooked it to his belt and shoved Julian forward, away from the gunfire tearing the edge of the plateau to pieces. They staggered across the high ground. The plateau was a narrow spine of rock, offering no cover and nowhere to hide. 200 yards ahead, the ground simply ended. They reached the edge. The drop-off was sheer, plunging 300 feet down into a massive shadowed gorge. The walls of the gorge were jagged red sandstone, carved into treacherous layers by thousands of years of flash floods. At the bottom, a dry riverbed of white boulders twisted away to the south. Brill looked back. 3 figures crested the smoke-filled lip of the plateau behind them. They moved in a tight, disciplined wedge, their rifles up, scanning the brush. They were 400 yards away. Brill looked down at the precipice. A narrow, crumbling shelf of shale zigzagged down the rock face, a precarious goat path barely a foot wide. "Down," Brill said. He pushed Julian onto the narrow ledge. The accountant whimpered, his hands clawing desperately at the sheer rock wall as his ruined feet slipped on the loose shale. Brill stepped onto the ledge behind him, putting his body between Julian and the drop. He kept his right hand on the rock wall, and his left hand wrapped in the heavy webbing of Julian's harness. A sharp crack echoed across the plateau. A bullet struck the rock face a foot above Brill's head, showering them in sharp splinters of red stone. The mercenaries had spotted them on the cliff face. "Move," Brill said, shoving Julian down the steep incline. Julian lost his footing completely. His knees buckled, and he slid forward, his weight dragging Brill down with him. Brill let go of the rifle. He slammed his body hard against the rock wall, driving his boots into the loose shale to break their descent. The jagged stone tore through his shirt, scraping the skin off his shoulder and back. His injured ribs ground against the hard surface, sending a blinding flash of white-hot pain through his skull. He held on to the harness. Julian dangled over the edge for a terrifying second before Brill hauled him back onto the narrow shelf. More bullets hammered the cliff face around them. The mercenaries had reached the edge of the plateau and were firing straight down. Brill drew the MK-23 pistol from his holster. He didn't look up. He pointed the heavy weapon blindly over his shoulder and fired 3 rapid shots toward the lip of the cliff. The incoming fire paused as the shooters ducked back from the edge. "Keep moving," Brill said, his voice a strained, ragged wheeze. They scrambled down the rest of the goat path, half falling, half sliding in an avalanche of loose rock and dust. They hit the floor of the gorge hard, collapsing into the dry riverbed among the massive white boulders. Brill dropped the empty pistol. He grabbed his injured side, curling inward as he fought to draw air into his lungs. The pain was absolute, a suffocating band of iron tightening around his chest. High above them, a voice echoed down the canyon walls. "They are in the wash. Move up." Brill forced himself to his feet. He picked up the MK-23, holstered it, and retrieved the dropped MK-18 rifle from the rocks where it had fallen during their slide. He checked the action. The breach was clear of dust. Julian lay face down in the gravel, unmoving. Brill grabbed him under the armpits and dragged him into the deep shadow of a house-sized boulder. "Get up," Brill said. Julian didn't respond. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. The frantic scramble down the cliff had pushed his failing body past its absolute limit. Brill slapped him hard across the face. Julian groaned, his eyelids fluttering. "Croft's men are coming down the cliff," Brill said, checking the magazine of the rifle. "They have the high ground. They will sweep this gorge." He looked down the length of the dry riverbed. The towering sandstone walls pressed inward, creating a twisting shadowed corridor that offered no exit. They had survived the descent, but they had traded an exposed plateau for a deep stone coffin. Brill hauled Julian upright, throwing the accountant's heavy arm over his shoulder to bear the weight. He leaned heavily on his good side, gritting his teeth against the burning agony in his ribs, and started walking south into the deepening shadows. A mile behind them, the first dark shapes began to rappel down the cliff face. Chapter 16. The white boulders of the dry wash glowed with a sickly, fading light. The sun dipped behind the western rim of the gorge, plunging the canyon floor into a deep, premature twilight. The air trapped between the towering sandstone walls was stagnant, a heavy baking blanket that smelled of hot dust and crushed sage. Brill kept his left arm locked under Julian's armpit. He dragged the accountant through the loose gravel. Julian's boots left twin jagged furrows in the dirt. His chin rested on his chest, a thick string of saliva hanging from his cracked lips. He had stopped shivering. He had stopped making any sound at all. With every dragging step, the broken ribs ground against Brill's lungs. The pain radiated up his neck and down his left arm, a hot, continuous current of agony. He tasted copper and bile. He leaned heavily on his right leg, favoring his battered left side, his breathing a harsh, ragged scrape in the quiet canyon. A mile behind them, the gorge amplified the sound of the hunt. The rhythmic crunch of heavy combat boots on loose stone rolled down the twisting corridor. The acoustics of the canyon wall bounced the noise forward, making it impossible to gauge the exact distance. They were moving at a disciplined, relentless jog. Brill dragged Julian toward the canyon wall. The flash floods of 1,000 monsoons had undercut the red sandstone here, carving a shallow concave depression into the base of the cliff. Brill let go of the harness. Julian collapsed into the dirt, folding into a loose, unmoving pile in the deepest part of the shadow. Brill dropped to one knee. He grabbed his injured side, squeezing his eyes shut as a wave of blinding dizziness washed over him. The blood loss and dehydration were critical. The edges of his vision swam with gray static. He forced his eyes open. He looked back up the dry riverbed. The wash narrowed 50 yards ahead. The sheer rock walls pinched inward, creating a tight S-shaped bend choked with massive smooth white boulders. The geometry offered zero lateral cover for anyone moving through the bottleneck. It was a choke point. Brill unslung the captured Mk-18 rifle. He checked the magazine in the dimming light. 20 rounds of 5.56 mm armor-piercing ammunition. He had 2 spare magazines shoved in his vest. He stood up. He walked to the center of the dry wash, directly in the path of the advancing mercenaries. He grabbed the largest rock he could lift with one hand and placed it precisely on top of a flat white boulder. He took another rock and placed it next to the first. He built a small, completely unnatural cairn in the middle of the riverbed. He retreated to the undercut wall where Julian lay. He climbed the pile of debris piled up against the cliff face, stepping onto a flat shelf of sandstone 5 feet above the canyon floor. The shelf was draped in deep shadow. He went prone on the rock. The hard stone pressed brutally into his broken ribs. A sharp gasp tore from his throat. He bit down on his own tongue, using the fresh pain in his mouth to clear the gray static from his vision. He pushed the rifle barrel over the edge of the shelf. He didn't aim down the canyon. He aimed the red dot optic directly at the small pile of rocks he had built in the center of the wash. The crunch of boots grew louder. Small rocks clattered against one another as the pursuit force navigated the bend. Two men appeared in the twilight. They were the point element, moving 10 yards ahead of the main body. They wore night vision goggles flipped up on their helmets, relying on the fading ambient light. They moved with absolute tactical precision, their rifles sweeping the shadows, their boots finding the quietest paths through the gravel. They reached the S-shaped bend. They entered the bottleneck. The lead mercenary saw the small pile of rocks resting on the white boulder. He stopped. He raised a closed fist. The second mercenary froze instantly, his rifle coming up to his shoulder. They recognized the anomaly. They knew a human hand had placed those stones. The lead man stared at the marker, his mind calculating the trap, his eyes scanning the immediate area for tripwires or explosives. Brill exhaled. He squeezed the trigger. He fired a 3-round burst. The unsuppressed Mk-18 roared in the confined space of the slot canyon. The sound was a physical hammer blow, an apocalyptic crack of thunder that bounced violently between the sheer walls. The recoil slammed the rifle stock into Brill's shoulder, driving the kinetic energy straight down into his broken ribs. White-hot agony exploded in his chest. His vision flashed to pure blinding white. Down in the wash, the lead mercenary absorbed all 3 rounds in his chest. The heavy armor-piercing slugs chewed through the ceramic strike plate of his vest. He was thrown backward off his feet, crashing heavily into the gravel. The second mercenary reacted before his partner hit the ground. He dove behind a massive white boulder, his rifle firing blindly toward the shadows along the canyon wall. Bullets snapped through the air around Brill's shelf. A round struck the sandstone inches from his face, showering him in sharp, stinging splinters of rock. Brill didn't flinch. He kept his optic trained on the edge of the white boulder. The mercenary leaned out to acquire a target. Brill fired twice. The rounds took the man in the face. His helmet snapped backward, and he crumpled into the dirt, sliding down the side of the smooth rock. The canyon fell into a ringing, absolute silence. Brill rolled onto his back, dragging the rifle with him. He curled his knees toward his chest, clutching his left side, his mouth open in a silent scream as the pain in his ribs spiked into a suffocating crescendo. He fought for air, taking shallow, ragged sips of oxygen to keep his lungs from expanding against the broken bone. Down the canyon, a voice echoed in the twilight. "Contact front. Point is down." Croft's main element had stopped. They had heard the ambush. They knew the gorge was plugged. Brill forced himself onto his hands and knees. Blood dripped from a cut on his cheek, splashing onto the sandstone shelf. He grabbed the rifle and slid down the debris pile, collapsing next to Julian in the undercut shadow. The accountant didn't move. The deafening roar of the gunfire hadn't even caused him to flinch. Brill reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the side of Julian's neck. The pulse was there, faint, erratic, and racing. Brill leaned back against the cool rock wall. He dropped the empty magazine from the Mk-18 and slammed a fresh one home. He had killed the vanguard. He had established the choke point. But he had also drawn a line in the sand. Silas Croft knew exactly where they were now, and the ex-JSOC commander would not push his men blindly into a fatal bottleneck. The sun vanished completely. The gorge plunged into total darkness. Brill closed his eyes, listening to the silence, waiting for the thermals and the night vision optics to turn the black canyon into a killing field. Chapter 17. The darkness in the bottom of the gorge was absolute. The towering sandstone walls blocked the starlight, creating a sensory void where the only reality was the smell of hot dust and the taste of copper. Brill pressed his back against the cool rock of the undercut shelf. His left hand hovered inches from Julian's face, feeling the erratic, shallow puffs of the accountant's breath. He did not touch him. Any movement, Any sound was a beacon. A faint, high-pitched hum vibrated through the still air. It was a sound felt in the teeth before it registered in the ears. The mechanical whine of miniature, high RPM electric motors. Brill tilted his head back, searching the black ribbon of sky visible between the canyon rims. He saw nothing, but the hum grew steadily louder, dropping in pitch as it descended into the gorge. Croft was not sending men into the fatal bottleneck. He was sending eyes. A micro-drone, no larger than a hummingbird, drifted down from the canyon rim. It emitted a faint, dull red glow from a single status light on its belly. It hovered 30 feet above the dry riverbed, its gimbal-mounted optics sweeping the darkness. Brill closed his eyes, shrinking deeper into the deepest shadow of the undercut. The drone was equipped with thermal imaging. In the cool night air of the canyon, a human body was a blazing white flare on a digital screen. The hum paused directly over the choke point where Brill had killed the vanguard. A sharp, metallic crack echoed down the canyon. A bright white flare erupted 50 yards up the wash. Croft's men had fired an illumination round from a 40mm launcher. The flare burned with a brilliant, blinding intensity, hanging in the air beneath a small parachute. The harsh white light flooded the S-shaped bend, casting stark, razor-sharp shadows behind every boulder and crevice. The illumination stripped away Brill's primary defense. He squeezed his eyes shut against the sudden glare, fighting the urge to bring a hand up to shield his face. The sudden movement would be a thermal spike. The micro-drone darted forward, exploiting the light. It zipped through the bottleneck, its camera panning rapidly across the rock shelf where Brill lay hidden. The drone stopped. It hovered 10 feet away, perfectly level with Brill's face. The red status light blinked twice in rapid succession. It had acquired a thermal signature. It had found the heat radiating from Julian's feverish body. Brill brought the Mk-18 up in a single fluid motion. He didn't aim down the sights. He pointed the barrel directly at the hovering red light and squeezed the trigger. A single, suppressed cough of the captured rifle. Brill had stripped the suppressor from the dead vanguard operator, shattered the quiet. The drone disintegrated. Shards of black plastic and pulverized circuitry rained down onto the sand. The flare sputtered and died, plunging the canyon back into total darkness. Movement in the bottleneck, a voice echoed from up the canyon, amplified by the rock walls. Target acquired. Croft's main element had used the drone as bait. They knew exactly where the shot had come from. A heavy, sustained roar of automatic gunfire chewed into the sandstone shelf. Pulverized rock exploded into the air, showering Brill and Julian in sharp splinters of stone. Croft was using a light machine gun to suppress the shelf while his riflemen advanced. Brill rolled hard to his right, dragging the Mk-18 with him, ignoring the fresh wave of agony tearing through his ribs. He slid off the shelf, landing heavily in the soft sand of the riverbed beside the catatonic accountant. Bullets snapped through the air inches above their heads. The air instantly filled with the acrid smell of pulverized rock and cordite. "Get up," Brill said, grabbing the webbing of Julian's harness. Julian groaned, a wet rattling sound. He didn't move. His body was completely shut down, his mind lost in a labyrinth of pain and dehydration. Brill hauled him upright, throwing the accountant's dead weight over his right shoulder. The sudden exertion felt like a hot knife twisting in his chest. He clamped his jaw shut, tasting blood from a bitten tongue, and staggered deeper into the gorge. He moved blindly through the twisting corridor of white boulders, relying entirely on touch and memory of the terrain he had glimpsed during the flare. Behind them, the machine gun fire stopped. Moving up. The crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel resumed. They were advancing through the bottleneck, using the cover of darkness and their superior night vision optics. Brill rounded a sharp bend in the canyon wall. The gorge widened slightly here, opening into a small circular depression carved by ancient floodwaters. In the center of the depression stood a massive, solitary pillar of red sandstone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. It was a natural barricade. Brill dropped Julian roughly behind the stone pillar. He unslung the Mk-18 and checked the magazine by feel. 12 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. He drew a fragmentation grenade from his vest, one he had stripped from the dead vanguard. He didn't pull the pin. He placed the grenade carefully on the flat top of a waist-high boulder, positioning it directly in the path of anyone rounding the bend into the depression. He took the captured suppressor off the Mk-18 and placed it next to the grenade. He was building another marker. He retreated behind the stone pillar, kneeling beside Julian. He drew the heavy Mk-23 pistol, pressing his back against the cool rock. He regulated his breathing, forcing air past the jagged edges of his broken ribs, waiting for the pursuit to find the bait. The crunch of boots stopped just beyond the bend. "Hold!" a voice whispered, distorted by the canyon acoustics. Two dark shapes detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the canyon wall, moving into the depression. They wore heavy quad-tube night vision goggles, their faces glowing with a faint green light. They swept the area with their rifles, moving with disciplined caution. The lead mercenary spotted the grenade and the suppressor resting on the boulder. He stopped instantly, raising a closed fist. The second man froze, his rifle coming up to cover his partner. They stared at the objects, their night vision optics revealing the crude trap. They recognized the tactic. They remembered the rock cairn in the bottleneck. "Decoy," the lead man whispered into his radio. "Target is baiting the trail. Proceed with caution." Brill stepped out from behind the stone pillar. He didn't fire the Mk-18. The muzzle flash would blind his own natural night vision and pinpoint his location for the rest of the squad. He brought the heavy Mk-23 up in a two-handed grip. He fired twice. The heavy .45 caliber slugs hit the lead mercenary square in the chest. The impact shattered the ceramic strike plate of his vest, driving him backward into the sand with a heavy thud. The second man reacted instantly, swinging his rifle toward the muzzle flash. Brill dropped to one knee, firing 3 rapid shots. The heavy rounds tore through the mercenary's thigh and pelvis. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock, and collapsed onto the gravel, his rifle firing wildly into the air. Brill didn't wait to finish the kill. He grabbed the Mk-18 and scrambled back behind the stone pillar, dragging Julian deeper into the shadows as the canyon erupted with return fire from the main element holding behind the bend. They were trapped in the depression, pinned behind a single pillar of rock, while Silas Croft brought his hammer down on the anvil Brill had just created. Chapter 18. The sandstone pillar vibrated under the sustained impact of the light machine gun. High-velocity rounds chewed into the smooth red rock, sending a continuous shower of pulverized stone and jagged shrapnel down upon them. Brill lay flat on his stomach, his body covering Julian. He kept his head tucked, breathing shallowly through his nose to filter the choking cloud of rock dust. The air in the circular depression smelled of cordite and pulverized ancient earth. Croft's machine gunner had the pillar perfectly bracketed. He was firing short, disciplined 3-second bursts, keeping them pinned while the rifleman moved into the depression to secure flanking angles. Brill slid the Mk-18 rifle forward. He rested the hot barrel against the base of the pillar. He wiped a mixture of sweat and stone dust from his eyes. He looked toward the entrance of the depression. Invisible infrared lasers sliced through the swirling dust cloud, originating from the unseen mercenaries moving up the wash. To a man wearing night vision goggles, the lasers were bright green spears pointing directly at the target. To Brill's naked eye, the gorge was simply a black void, punctuated by the blinding muzzle flashes of the suppression fire. He didn't need to see the men. He knew exactly where they were moving. They were following the path he had laid out for them, funneling past the boulder where he had left his marker. Brill brought the rifle stock into his right shoulder. He regulated his breathing, fighting the sharp, stabbing agony in his broken ribs. He aimed into the blackness, relying on his spatial memory of the depression and the faint silhouette of the waist-high boulder illuminated by the muzzle flashes. He waited for the machine gun to pause at the end of a burst. The heavy hammering stopped. The metallic clatter of the gunner's bolt locking to the rear echoed through the gorge. He was reloading. Brill leaned out from the cover of the pillar. He fired a single shot. The heavy, armor-piercing 5.56 mm round crossed the 30 yards of open space and struck the M67 fragmentation grenade resting on the flat top of the boulder. The detonation was an apocalyptic crack of thunder in the confined space. The blast wave hit the sandstone pillar a fraction of a second later, a physical wall of pressure that drove the air from Brill's lungs. Shards of the pulverized boulder and jagged steel shrapnel ripped through the depression. A man screamed from the darkness near the entrance, a ragged, wet sound that was instantly drowned out by the echoes of the explosion. Brill didn't retreat behind the pillar. The detonation had created a massive, blooming cloud of heat and pulverized rock. To the mercenaries wearing thermal optics and highly sensitive night vision tubes, the depression had just turned into a blinding, white-hot sun. Their optics would auto-gate, shutting down to protect the delicate internal circuitry from the flash, rendering them completely blind for several crucial seconds. Brill broke from cover. He scrambled over the loose gravel on his hands and knees, moving directly toward the two mercenaries he had killed minutes earlier. He reached the first body. The dead man lay on his back, his chest cavity destroyed by the .45 caliber rounds. Brill grabbed the man's helmet. He found the mounting bracket, pressed the release lever, and tore the heavy quad-tube night vision goggles free. He pulled the headset over his own skull, flipping the tubes down over his eyes. The world instantly resolved into a crisp, monochromatic green landscape. The dust cloud from the explosion swirled like a thick fog. Through the swirling particulate, he saw three mercenaries staggering near the entrance of the depression. Two were clawing at their helmets, trying to flip their washed-out optics up. The third was on his knees, clutching his face where a piece of shrapnel from the boulder had caught him. Brill raised the Mk-18. He fired 3 single, suppressed shots. The 3 men dropped into the dust. Brill turned away from the entrance. He ran back to the pillar, his boots slipping on the loose rock. The sudden sprint tore at the torn muscles in his ribs. He tasted fresh blood in the back of his throat. He dropped to one knee beside Julian. The accountant was curled into a tight fetal ball, his hands clamped over his ears. He was completely unresponsive to the environment, lost in the labyrinth of his own failing biology. "Get up," Brill said. He grabbed the heavy canvas webbing of Julian's tactical harness. He hauled the man upward, throwing his dead weight over his right shoulder. The exertion caused his vision to gray out around the edges. He bit down hard on the inside of his cheek, using the sharp sting of pain to force his brain to remain conscious. He staggered toward the back of the depression, away from the kill zone. The green glow of the night vision goggles revealed a narrow fissure in the sandstone wall, a jagged crack barely 3 feet wide. Carved by centuries of seasonal runoff, it twisted sharply into the solid mass of the mountain. Brill carried Julian into the fissure. The rock walls immediately pinched inward, scraping against Brill's shoulders and tearing at his tactical vest. The floor of the slot canyon was smooth, water-polished stone, slick with a fine layer of damp moss. They were moving deeper underground. The sounds of the gorge faded behind them, muffled by the twisting rock. They descended a steep, treacherous decline, slipping on the damp stone. Brill kept his right hand braced against the canyon wall, using the friction to control their descent. The air grew perceptibly cooler. The heavy, stagnant heat of the desert floor vanished, replaced by a deep, subterranean chill. The smell of hot dust was replaced by the sharp, mineral scent of stagnant water. The fissure widened abruptly, opening into a high-ceilinged cavern. Brill stopped. He adjusted the focus on the quad-tube goggles. The cavern was a massive, naturally formed cistern, a tinaya carved deep into the bedrock. The floor of the cavern was entirely covered by a pool of black water. The water was perfectly still, a dark mirror reflecting the green glow of Brill's optics. There were no shores. The smooth sandstone walls plunged straight down into the depths of the pool. The only way forward was through the water. Brill lowered Julian to the ground. The accountant slumped against the rock wall, his chin resting on his chest. His breathing was a faint, rattling wheeze. Brill knelt beside the water. He scooped a handful of the liquid and brought it to his face. It was ice cold and smelled heavily of limestone and ancient earth. He splashed it over his face, letting the freezing water wash away the crust of sweat and rock dust. He uncapped his canteen, submerging it in the pool until the plastic vessel filled. He turned back to Julian. He grabbed the accountant's jaw, forcing his head up. He pressed the rim of the canteen against Julian's cracked, bleeding lips. "Drink," Brill said. He poured a small measure of water into the man's mouth. Julian choked, sputtering weakly, but the primal reflex took over. He swallowed. Brill poured another small measure. "They are going to secure the depression," Brill said, looking back up the dark tunnel they had just descended. "Croft will find the bodies. He will track the drag marks to this fissure." He capped the canteen and hooked it to his belt. He checked the magazine of the Mk-18 by feel. 10 rounds left. He drew the heavy Mk-23 pistol and verified a round was chambered. He looked back at the black expanse of the subterranean pool. The quad-tube goggles couldn't penetrate the surface of the water. He had no way to gauge the depth, no way to know if there were underwater obstructions or a current. He reached down and hauled Julian upright. "We swim," Brill said. He dragged the accountant to the edge of the stone shelf and stepped off into the black water. Chapter 19. The thermal shock drove the breath from Brill's lungs. The water in the tinaya was barely above freezing. It clamped around his chest like an iron vice, instantly sapping the residual heat from his muscles. He sank below the surface, dragging Julian with him. He kicked upward, breaking the surface and gasping for air. The sudden expansion of his lungs ground the broken edges of his ribs together. White-hot agony flared across his left side, momentarily blinding him. He clamped his jaw shut and forced his breathing into shallow, rapid sips. Julian thrashed weakly, a primal panic cutting through his catatonia as the freezing water flooded his mouth. Brill grabbed the thick webbing at the back of the accountant's tactical harness, locking his elbow to keep the man's face above the waterline. Brill pushed the heavy night vision goggles up onto his helmet. They were useless here. The cavern was a sensory void. He began to swim. He used a modified side stroke, relying entirely on his right arm and his legs. Every rotation of his torso tore at the ruined muscles in his ribs. The cold water acted as a crude anesthetic on his torn skin, but it simultaneously thickened his blood, slowing his reaction time and stealing his gross motor control. He navigated blindly, pulling Julian's dead weight through the black water. He aimed for the center of the pool, putting distance between himself and the stone shelf they had just abandoned. A sharp, metallic clatter echoed through the cavern. Brill stopped swimming. He treaded water silently, fighting the urge to shiver. 3 brilliant beams of white light pierced the darkness high above and behind them. Croft's tracking team had emerged from the fissure onto the stone shelf. The powerful tactical flashlights swept the massive cavern, carving stark geometric shapes out of the gloom. The beams hit the smooth sandstone walls, reflecting downward to dance across the glassy surface of the black pool. "Blood trail ends at the shelf," a voice echoed across the water, the acoustics of the cavern amplifying the sound. "Check the waterline," a second voice commanded. One of the flashlight beams snapped downward, tracing the edge of the stone shelf before panning out across the open water. The light moved with disciplined precision, searching for ripples, bubbles, or the floating debris of a target. The beam swept toward the center of the pool. "Take a breath," Brill said. He didn't wait to see if Julian complied. He drove his right hand down onto Julian's shoulder, forcing the accountant under the surface, and immediately submerged himself. The cold was absolute. Brill kept his eyes open, staring up through the water. A few feet above, the surface lit up with a brilliant, blinding white glare as the flashlight beam passed directly over them. Julian panicked. He kicked wildly, his boots striking Brill's shins. He grabbed Brill's tactical vest, trying to claw his way back to the air. Brill wrapped his right arm around Julian's chest, pinning the man's arms against his sides. He squeezed hard, locking them together in the freezing depths. He ignored the burning need for oxygen in his own lungs, watching the faint glow of the flashlight beam move away. He felt a subtle shift in the water pressure. It wasn't the erratic turbulence of Julian's thrashing. It was a steady, persistent pull against his legs. The water at the bottom of the Tinaya was moving. Brill released his grip on Julian and kicked toward the surface. They broke the waterline simultaneously. Julian gasped violently, choking and spitting up mouthfuls of stagnant water. Brill clamped a hand over Julian's mouth. The flashlight beams were still sweeping the far walls of the cavern. The mercenaries were scanning the perimeter, looking for another exit. "Nothing visible on the surface," the first voice echoed. "They went under," the second voice replied. "Set up a perimeter on the shelf. Bring up the thermal optics. We wait for them to surface or freeze." Croft's men were establishing a siege on the only known dry ground. They knew the freezing water was a lethal weapon. They just had to let the environment do the killing. Brill removed his hand from Julian's mouth. He felt the pull against his legs again, stronger now. A subterranean current was drawing water out of the cavern. He pulled the night vision goggles down over his eyes. The world resolved into monochromatic green. He scanned the surface of the water ahead of them. 30 yards away, the smooth sandstone wall of the cavern met the waterline without a break. He dove beneath the surface again, keeping his eyes open. The green glow of the ambient light-gathering tubes failed completely in the murky depths. He switched on the headset's built-in infrared illuminator. A narrow, circular tunnel appeared in the rock wall, 10 feet below the surface. The current was funneling directly into it. It was a siphon, a submerged passage carved by centuries of flowing water leading deeper into the mountain. Brill surfaced. His teeth began to chatter, a violent, involuntary tremor seizing his jaw. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly. "Take a deep breath," Brill said, grabbing Julian's harness. "Hold it." He hauled Julian under the water. He kicked hard, fighting the buoyancy of their tactical vests. He aimed directly for the dark opening of the siphon. The current caught them as they neared the rock face, accelerating their descent. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. The smooth, water-polished stone scraped against Brill's helmet as he was pulled inside. He kept his grip on Julian, letting the current carry them forward. The passage twisted sharply downward. Brill's lungs burned, a tight, suffocating band constricting his chest. He felt Julian go completely limp in his grasp. The accountant had lost consciousness, his body surrendering to the lack of oxygen. The tunnel leveled out, running horizontally through the solid bedrock. Brill kicked his legs, adding his own momentum to the current. The infrared illuminator revealed only smooth stone walls rushing past. There was no air pocket, no break in the solid pipe of water. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. His muscles burned with lactic acid. The urge to inhale water became a screaming primal demand in his brain. The current accelerated suddenly. The tunnel walls fell away. They shot out of the siphon, and tumbled into an open expanse of water. Brill kicked desperately toward the surface. He broke the waterline, gasping frantically. The air was stale and smelled heavily of bat guano and wet limestone. He dragged Julian up beside him, hauling the unconscious man's head back. Brill treaded water, sweeping his infrared light across the new environment. They were in a low-ceilinged limestone cave. The walls were jagged and rough, draped in thick stalactites. 10 feet away, a sloping bank of pale dry mud rose out of the water. Brill swam toward the bank, hauling Julian through the shallows. He dug his boots into the soft mud and dragged the accountant completely out of the water. He collapsed onto his back in the mud. He lay there, his chest heaving, his body shaking violently in the grip of severe hypothermia. The silence in the cave was absolute, broken only by the ragged scrape of his own breathing. He rolled onto his side and crawled over to Julian. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of the man's neck. The pulse was faint, erratic, and dangerously slow. Julian's skin was ice-cold to the touch. They had escaped the guns, but they had traded the kill zone for a freezing tomb. Chapter 20. The violent tremors racking Brill's body made his muscles useless. The wet mud beneath him drained the last reserves of his core temperature. The darkness of the cave pressed inward, absolute and crushing. He forced himself onto his hands and knees. Every movement was a negotiation with failing biology. He crawled to Julian and grabbed the heavy canvas webbing of the accountant's harness. He hauled Julian up. The dead weight pulled agonizingly at Brill's broken ribs. He locked his jaw against the pain, using the fresh spike of agony to force a surge of adrenaline into his freezing blood. He dragged Julian away from the subterranean pool. The mudbank sloped sharply upward, transitioning into a field of jagged limestone breakdown. The air here held a subtle, dry current. It smelled faintly of baked earth and sagebrush. A draft was pulling through the cavern, drawing air from the surface down into the depths. Brill abandoned the night vision goggles. He navigated entirely by touch and the direction of the faint air current. He hauled Julian over massive shattered boulders, his wet boots slipping on the slick stone. His hands were numb, bleeding from a dozen fresh scrapes he could barely feel. The incline grew steeper. The cavern narrowed into a vertical fissure. A faint gray glow illuminated the jagged edges of the rock overhead. Brill wedged himself into the fissure. He planted his boots against one wall and his back against the other. He reached down, grabbed Julian's harness, and hoisted the unconscious man up to rest across his thighs. He pushed upward, using his legs to drive them both higher into the chimney. The broken bone in his chest ground against his lung with every agonizing thrust. He tasted fresh blood. He took shallow, rapid sips of the dry air, focusing his entirely degrading cognitive functions on the next few inches of rock. He pushed Julian over the lip of the fissure. He pulled himself up and collapsed onto flat, solid stone. The Sonora Desert stretched out before them. The morning sun had just breached the eastern horizon. The light washed over the high plateau, a brilliant, blinding glare that immediately began to bake the freezing moisture from their skin. The ambient temperature was already climbing rapidly. The desert, their executioner yesterday, was their physician today. Brill lay on his back on the red sandstone. He closed his eyes, letting the brutal heat soak into his shivering muscles. The tremors slowly subsided. His breathing leveled out into a harsh, steady rasp. He rolled over and looked at Julian. The accountant lay motionless, his face a pale, bruised mask. Brill stripped the soaked tactical vest from Julian's chest, leaving the man in his ruined, mud-caked dress shirt. He pressed 2 fingers to Julian's neck. The pulse was stronger, fueled by the sudden influx of heat. Brill opened a waterproof pouch on his own tactical belt. He extracted a small, heavy plastic cylinder. It was an encrypted emergency transponder. He flipped the safety cover back. He pressed the activation stud. A single green LED began to pulse on the top of the cylinder. The device was broadcasting a continuous, high-frequency burst to a specific orbital satellite. Brill set the transponder on the rock near Julian's head. Julian groaned. His eyelids fluttered open. He stared blindly at the blue sky for a long time, his mind struggling to process the transition from the freezing dark. He turned his head and looked at Brill. "We are out," Julian said. His voice was a dry, hollow scrape. "Yes," Brill said. "Croft?" Julian said, his eyes widening slightly as the memory of the cavern returned. "Croft is waiting at the edge of a subterranean pool," Brill said. "He will wait for bodies that will never surface." Julian looked at the pulsing green light of the transponder. He looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the Badlands. The low, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades led through the desert silence. A black, unmarked Sikorsky helicopter crested the southern ridge. It banked sharply, dropping low over the plateau. The pilot was tracking the signal from the transponder. Brill picked up the captured Mk-18 rifle. He checked the action, then slung the weapon across his back. He adjusted the straps of his vest, ignoring the hot flare of pain in his ribs. Julian watched him. "They will want a report," Julian said. "The firm." "Tell them the truth," Brill said. "Tell them you survived." Brill turned away. He walked toward the edge of the plateau, moving toward the deep, twisting arroyos of the Badlands. He descended into the shadows of a slot canyon, just as the heavy downwash of the helicopter's rotors began to whip the red dust into a blinding cloud. He did not look back. He melted into the heat haze and the jagged stone, leaving the accountant alone on the rock to wait for the sky to open. The end.